Everyone breaks eventually, he told her, standing in her ruined shop like he owned it already. The smart ones break before the fire starts. Cassidy Monroe looked at the man who had destroyed everything her mother built, and she smiled. Then I guess I'm not smart, she said. She was 29 years old, covered in grease and dried blood from a cut on her palm, standing in the wreckage of the only thing left of her mother. And she had never meant anything more in her life. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow every part until the end. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The call did not wake Cassidy Monroe because she had never gone to sleep. She had been lying on top of her covers since 2 in the morning, staring at the water stain on her bedroom ceiling that had looked like a carburetor since she was 7 constant years old, running numbers in her head that refused to add up no matter how many times she tried. The rent on the diagnostic equipment was due Friday. The compressor belt on Bay 3 had started squealing again. She had 3 customer vehicles scheduled for the week and 1 parts shipment that had now been delayed for the 9th consecutive day from a supplier she'd had used without a single problem for 6 years. When her phone lit up at 4:31 a.m., she was already sitting up. It was her security system, except it wasn't an alert. It was a failure notification. The entire system had gone offline. Cassidy was in her truck and moving before the notification finished loading. She told herself it was probably a power surge. She told herself the backup battery had finally given out after 4 winters of use. She told herself a dozen reasonable things during the 7-minute drive through Red Mesa's empty streets, and she believed none of them, because the same cold certainty that had kept her awake since 2 o'clock was now sitting in the passenger seat beside her, quiet and patient, waiting for her to stop pretending. She turned onto Commerce Row at 4:47 a.m. She saw the glass first. It caught the amber glow of the street lights and spread across the sidewalk in a wide, glittering fan. And for 1 full second, her brain refused to process what she was looking at. Then she was out of the truck before it fully stopped rolling, and the cold November air hit her face, and she heard it the sound of wind moving through a space that was supposed to be sealed. Every front window of Monroe Motor Works had been shattered inward. Cassidy stood on the sidewalk and looked at what used to be her shop, and something happened inside her chest that she would not be able to describe for weeks. It was not panic. It was not grief. It was something older and quieter, the feeling of a person who has already been surviving at the edge of their limit, discovering that the edge has been moved. She went inside anyway. The hydraulic lift in Bay 1 was damaged. The control column had been struck repeatedly with something heavy until the hydraulic line cracked, and fluid had pooled across the floor in a dark, spreading stain. The lift in Bay 2 was still functional, but the power panel feeding it had been ripped from the wall with enough force to expose the wiring behind it, and the wiring had been cut, not accidentally cut in 4 clean places with something sharp, which meant someone had stood there and done it deliberately, which meant someone had taken their time. The security camera housing was on the floor, not the camera, just the housing. Whoever had done this had removed the camera itself and taken it with them, which meant they knew it was there, which meant this was not random. The customer vehicles were the worst part. She had 3 cars in the shop. A 2019 Civic belonging to a retired schoolteacher named Margaret Okafor, who brought her vehicle in every 6 months and always left a bag of oranges on the front counter. A pickup truck belonging to Danny Reyes, who was 22 and had saved for 4 months to afford the transmission work she was doing for him at cost, because she had known his family since she was in school. And a restored 1987 El Camino that belonged to an 81-year-old man named Walter Briggs, who had been bringing vehicles to Monroe Motor Works since Cassidy's mother was the one doing the work, and who called Evelyn Monroe the only honest mechanic he had ever met in 50 years of driving. All 3 vehicles had been vandalized, tires slashed, mirrors snapped. Walter Briggs's El Camino had a deep gouge running the full length of the driver's side that went through the paint and into the metal underneath. Cassidy stood in the middle of her destroyed shop and breathed. She breathed deliberately, the way her mother had taught her to breathe when something broke and you needed your hands to stay steady. You didn't cry first. You assessed first. You figured out what was salvageable and what was gone. You made a list. Crying was something you did later, when the work was done, and sometimes later never came, and that was just the shape of things. She was still breathing and assessing when she saw the paper on her office door. It was not taped. It was impaled on a finishing nail that had been driven directly into the wood of the door with enough force to split the grain slightly. The paper was a single page, professionally formatted, with a logo at the top that read Voss Highway Development Group in clean corporate lettering. It was a purchase agreement for the property at 412 Commerce Row, Red Mesa, Arizona. The offered price was 3 times the assessed value of the land. There was a signature line at the bottom. Beneath it, in small, neat handwriting that did not match the printed document, someone had added 7 words. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Cassidy read it twice. Then she folded it carefully, put it in the back pocket of her jeans, and called Detective Naomi Ruiz. She had met Naomi Ruiz 3 months earlier, the first time she had gone to the police. That visit had been about a parts shipment, her regular supplier, a man named Carl Denning, who operated a regional auto parts warehouse 40 miles east of Red Mesa, had called her apologetically to explain that her account had been flagged by his company's compliance department due to an anonymous report alleging that her business was associated with criminal activity. He couldn't tell her more than that. He was sorry. Her order was on hold indefinitely. She had stood in the police station and explained what had happened, and the officer at the front desk had taken notes and told her that anonymous reports to suppliers were not illegal, and that she was welcome to pursue civil remedies if she believed the report was false and defamatory. He had said this with the tone of a man who was already thinking about something else. Detective Ruiz had been walking through the lobby, carrying a coffee and a manila folder, and she had stopped and listened. Just stopped, right there in the lobby, and listened to everything Cassidy said. Then she asked 3 questions. When was the report filed? How long after you refused Grant Voss's offer? And has anything else changed since you said no? Those 3 questions told Cassidy that Ruiz was the right person to call at 4:53 on a Monday morning. Ruiz arrived 19 minutes later. She walked through the shop without saying much, just looking at things the way a person looks at something they are memorizing rather than simply observing. She photographed the purchase agreement, still in the shape of Cassidy's back pocket when Cassidy pulled it out. She photographed the cut wiring. She crouched near the hydraulic fluid pool and looked at the damage to the control column for a long time. This took tools, Ruiz said, and time. Whoever did this wasn't panicked. They were methodical, I know, Cassidy said. Your cameras. They took them. Left the housings. Ruiz straightened up. That's not a smash and grab crew. That's someone who has done this before, or someone who was told exactly what to do. Cassidy sat down on an overturned creeper. Her hands were shaking very slightly, and she pressed them flat against her thighs because she did not want them to shake. I can't close. I have 3 customer vehicles in here that I can't return in this condition. I have a parts shipment I'm already 9 days behind on. If I close for repairs, I'm probably done. Ruiz looked at her steadily. How long can you stay open? I don't know. 30 days. Maybe. If the insurance company is fast, which they won't be. If my customers don't walk, which some of them will. She paused. If whoever did this doesn't come back. Ruiz nodded slowly. I'm going to be honest with you, Cassidy. Right now, I have vandalism, breaking and entering, and a purchase agreement that was left on your door without a direct threat written on it. Voss's people will say they didn't leave the handwriting. They'll say a third party did it. The evidence is real, but it's not a straight line yet. I know, Cassidy said again. So don't disappear. Keep every document, every invoice, every canceled order and delayed shipment. Build me a timeline so detailed that I can follow it like a map. I've already been building one. Something shifted in Ruiz's expression, not surprise. Exactly, but recognition. Good. Then let's talk about what we do next. She had inherited the shop 4 years ago when her mother died. Evelyn Monroe had been 53 years old and had fought the cancer for 11 months with the same focus and organized stubbornness she brought to diagnosing a misfiring engine. She had kept working through chemotherapy as long as she could drive herself to the shop. She had made Cassidy sit beside her during the last months and walk through every system, every supplier relationship, every loyal customer, and every difficult one, as though she was transferring not just a business but a living body of knowledge that had taken 30 years to accumulate. People will test you, Evelyn had told her. Near the end, when talking had become difficult and she chose her words carefully. Not because you're young, not because you're a woman, because everyone who takes over something someone else built gets tested. You just answer the question the same way I did, with the work. Monroe Motor Works had been one of Red Mesa's first shops, run by a woman mechanic, and Evelyn had spent the early years fighting for every customer she had. She'd had to be twice as thorough, twice as patient, and twice as willing to explain things that a male mechanic could have gotten away with just doing. She had never framed that as bitterness. She had framed it as competitive advantage. I have to be better, she used to say. So I am. Cassidy had inherited that standard along with the building. For the first 2 years, she had operated at a loss because trust did not transfer automatically with a lease agreement. She had to earn it separately from everything her mother had earned. She never sold a customer a repair they didn't need. When old Pete Garrido came in, convinced his alternator was failing, and she diagnosed it as a loose connection and 37-cent part, she fixed it for free, and he told everyone he knew. When the monsoon season left 3 elderly drivers stranded with flooded engines, she went to them, charged only for parts, and refused tips. Slowly, the town came around. She was 25 when she started, and she had been called a girl more times than she could count, and she had corrected people exactly once each time, and then never mentioned it again because she had more important things to think about. She organized free motorcycle safety inspections for travelers passing through on Route 17. She established a monthly ski tenant maintenance day for residents over 65 because she'd watched her mother do the same thing. And she understood that it was not charity, it was community, which was a different thing. By the time Grant Voss appeared with his offer, Monroe Motor Works was the most trusted independent shop in Red Mesa, which was, she would later understand, precisely why he wanted her gone rather than simply going around her. She had met Grant Voss 4 months ago in this same office, which had still had its windows then. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, and he wore the kind of calm that rich men develop when they have spent enough years having other people's problems solved for them. He was not rude. He was precise. He sat in the chair across from her desk and explained his development project with the measured enthusiasm of someone who had given the same presentation 60 times and was confident it worked. The Voss Highway Complex would be the largest highway services development in the southwestern corridor. Fueling stations, restaurants, a hotel, 2 commercial vehicle service centers. It would create jobs. It would bring tax revenue to Red Mesa. It would transform a struggling section of commerce into something that could anchor the town's economy for 30 years. The only thing standing between the complex and its groundbreaking was the property at 412 Commerce Row. Her property. I'm prepared to offer you 3 times the assessed value, he said. That is not a negotiating position. That is my ceiling. You could retire from the repair business tomorrow and buy a house with a cash offer in any city in this state. Cassidy had listened to all of it. Then she had said, "This shop has been in my family for 30 years. My mother built it. It's not for sale." Voss had looked at her for a moment in the particular way that some men looked at a woman who had just said something they had not anticipated. Not hostile. Evaluating. Deciding whether the objection was emotional and therefore temporary, or structural and therefore a problem. "I understand this has sentimental value," he said. "It's not sentimental. It's operational. This is how I make my living, and this community depends on it. Those are practical reasons, not emotional ones." He had nodded as though filing that away. "Take some time. Think it over." "I don't need time," she said. The answer is no. He stood and he buttoned his jacket and he smiled the way that people smile when they believe the current conversation is only the first in a longer negotiation they are confident of winning. Sentimental businesses rarely survive financial reality. Miss Monroe, I hope yours proves me wrong. He had left. She had watched his car pull away from the lot, and she had felt, in the back of her sternum, the first cold pressure of something she would only name later, the understanding that saying no to certain men was not an ending. It was an opening move in a game she had not agreed to play. 6 weeks later, her parts shipments were delayed. 8 weeks after that, an anonymous complaint triggered a city environmental inspection that cost her $1,100 and 4 days of partial closure, even though the inspector found nothing out of compliance. A week after that, reviews began appearing online. 12 of them in 3 days, all from accounts with no history, all citing the same vague allegation that Monroe Motor Works had performed dangerous work and then refused accountability. Cassidy documented every one of them, timestamped and saved. And now she stood in her destroyed shop at 5 in the morning, and Grant Voss's purchase agreement sat folded in her pocket. And the question was no longer whether he was behind this. The question was how to prove it. She spent the morning calling customers. She called Margaret Okafor first, because Margaret deserved to hear it directly from Cassidy rather than through the town grapevine, which in Red Mesa traveled faster than any form of modern communication. She apologized for the damage to the Civic. She explained what had happened with as much calm as she could assemble. She told Margaret that she would handle the repair costs personally. Margaret Okafor was 67 years old and had taught 4th grade in Red Mesa for 22 years. She said, "Cassidy, your mother fixed my first car when I moved here in 1989, and she charged me half what every other shop quoted me. Don't you dare apologize to me. What do you need?" Cassidy was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet. When you figure it out, you call back." "I mean that." She called Danny Reyes next. Danny was less composed than Margaret, which made sense. The truck was everything he had, and he had been saving for the transmission work for months, and the vandalism made everything worse and more expensive. But when she explained that she would cover the additional damage, his voice changed. "Cassidy, that's not, you shouldn't have to." "I know I shouldn't have to," she said, "but I am." "That's not a discussion." Walter Briggs did not answer his phone. She drove to his house. He was 81 years old, and he opened the door in a flannel shirt and looked at her face and said, before she could say a single word, "How bad is the El Camino?" She told him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That car belonged to my wife before she passed. I've had it 40 years. Your mother repainted it for me in 2008 and wouldn't take more than the cost of materials." "I know," Cassidy said. "I don't want you paying for this out of your pocket." "I know, but I am." He looked at her for another long moment, the way old men look at young women who are being stubborn, in a way that reminds them of someone. "You know what your mother would say? She'd say, 'Stop arguing and get back to work.'" Walter Briggs almost smiled. "No. She'd say the same thing she always said when someone tried to take something from her." He paused. "She'd say, 'They can have my shop when I'm in the ground, and maybe not even then.'" Cassidy drove back to the shop. She put on her coveralls. She got to work. She had been cleaning the wreckage for 2 hours, salvaging what was salvageable, photographing what was damaged, creating the meticulous inventory that Detective Ruiz had told her she would need when she found the photograph. It was behind her mother's original workbench, not on top of it or near it, but behind it, slipped into the narrow gap between the bench and the wall, in a way that made Cassidy think it had been placed there deliberately, hidden from casual sight. The frame was old, the glass dusty but unbroken. The photograph was black and white, which surprised her because she knew from the style of her mother's hair that it was from some time in the 90s and should have been color. Her mother had preferred black and white photographs her entire life. Said they made things look the way they actually felt rather than the way they actually looked. Evelyn Monroe was standing beside a motorcycle, and beside her was a man who was enormous, 6'3" at least, wide through the shoulders, with a beard that reached his collar and hands that looked like they belonged on someone who had spent a lifetime forcing metal to cooperate. He was wearing a leather vest, and even in the faded photograph, the patches on it were visible. Cassidy leaned closer. The top rocker read Hell's Angels. She turned the frame over. On the back of the photograph, in her mother's handwriting, the same careful, slightly slanted handwriting that Cassidy had grown up watching, write invoices and repair estimates and grocery lists, were 8 words. Silas Kane, never forget the man who kept us alive on Route 17. Cassidy sat down on the floor of her destroyed shop, holding a photograph of her mother and a stranger, and she read those 8 words 4 more times. Her mother had never mentioned anyone named Silas Kane, not once in 29 years. The photograph had been hidden behind a workbench for long enough that the dust behind the bench had accumulated in a thin layer over the back of the frame. Whatever this man had meant to her mother, Evelyn Monroe had kept it private and specific, the way she kept everything that really mattered close, quiet, and exactly where she had chosen to put it. Cassidy put the photograph in her truck. She went back inside and kept working. At 6:14 p.m., she was alone in the shop, rinsing hydraulic fluid off her forearms in the utility sink when she heard a motorcycle. She heard a lot of motorcycles in Red Mesa. Route 17 ran directly through town and brought riders through in every season. And her free safety inspection program had made Monroe Motor Works a recognized stop for long-distance riders who needed a quick diagnostic check. She was used to engines outside her door. But this one stopped. She turned off the water and listened. The engine idled for a moment, then went quiet. She heard the heavy, specific sound of a kickstand being dropped. She dried her hands and walked out. He was standing beside a motorcycle that had clearly been ridden hard for a very long time and maintained with absolute meticulous care, the 2 states existing simultaneously in the way they did with machines that were genuinely loved. He was pulling off his helmet, and when he turned around, she saw that he was older, somewhere in his late 60s, with a gray beard trimmed shorter than the one in the photograph, but unmistakably the same beard. There was a scar along his left temple, thin and pale, the kind left by something that had hit hard and healed slowly. He was wearing a leather vest. The patches on it were exactly what she had spent the afternoon staring at in a black and white photograph. He looked at the damage to her shop, the boarded windows, the yellow police tape still strung across the entrance, the visible darkness inside, and something moved through his expression that was not pity and was not anger and was not quite either of those things. It was the expression of a person who has seen a specific kind of wrong before and has never entirely found a way to make peace with the fact that it keeps happening. Then he looked at her. "My name is Silas Kane," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried, the voice of a man who had stopped needing to speak loudly to be heard a long time ago. "I heard Evelyn's shop was in trouble." Cassidy stood in the cold evening air outside the ruins of her mother's life's work, and she looked at the man her mother had hidden in a photograph behind a workbench for 30 years, and she said the only thing that came to her. "How did you hear?" "Word travels," he said simply, "especially when it's the wrong kind." She studied him for a long moment. The vest, the scar, the hands. The way he was standing, not aggressive, not deferential, just present in the specific way that men stand when they have been through enough, that they no longer feel the need to perform either threat or harmlessness for a stranger's benefit. "She never mentioned you," Cassidy said. I know." He looked at the photograph she was still holding. She had forgotten she was holding it, and something passed through his face. That was her choice. I respected it then. I respect it now. "So why are you here?" He looked back at the shop, at the boarded windows and the broken sign and the police tape. "Because she kept her choice," he said quietly. "And whoever did this didn't keep theirs." He turned back to her. "And because Evelyn Monroe was the only person in 30 years who ever helped me without wanting something back. And the least I can do for a woman who's been dead 4 years is make sure what she built is still standing." The wind moved through the Commerce Row Street. Somewhere down the block, a car door closed. Cassidy Monroe looked at Silas Kane for a long time. "I don't want armed bikers in my shop," she finally said. I don't want a war. I don't want Voss to have one more excuse to say I'm dangerous. Good, Silas said, because that's not what I'm offering. He held her gaze steadily. I'm not here to fight your battle. I'm here to make sure you're still standing when you fight it yourself. He paused. There's a difference. Your mother knew the difference. Cassidy looked at the photograph in her hand, at her mother's face, younger than she had ever known it, standing by this enormous, gray-bearded man on a road that went somewhere she had never asked about. She thought about Walter Briggs saying, "They can have my shop when I'm in the ground," and maybe not even then. She thought about 30 days, maybe less. She looked up at Silas Kane. You know anything about hydraulic lifts? He almost smiled. It was small and slow and entirely genuine. I've forgotten more about hydraulic lifts than most mechanics ever learn. She stepped aside from the entrance. Then, come inside, she said, and I'll show you what they did. Silas Kane worked the way Cassidy's mother had worked, without wasted motion, without commentary, without the need to explain himself while his hands were busy doing the explaining for him. He crouched beside the damaged hydraulic lift in Bay 1, ran his fingers along the cracked line, pressed his thumb against the control column where the impact had buckled the casing, and was quiet for a long time. Not the quiet of a man who didn't know what he was looking at. The quiet of a man who was adding up something and didn't like the sum. They used a pipe, he said. 24 inches, maybe 30. Whoever swung it knew where to hit. How do you know that? Because they hit the same spot 4 times and nothing else. Amateurs hit everything. Someone who knows equipment hits the one place that ends it. He stood up slowly, the way large men stood when their knees had accumulated years of hard use, and looked at her. Someone told them where to swing. Cassidy had already figured that. Hearing it said out loud made it more real, in the way that spoken things always did, settling into a different weight than the same thought living only inside your head. Can you fix it? The line I can fix tonight. The column casing I can brace well enough to run tomorrow morning. You'll need a proper replacement part within 2 weeks or the brace will give. He looked at the second lift, the one with the cut wiring. That one's a different problem. You need an electrician. I know an electrician. Then call him. She did. His name was Ray Montoya. He was 54 years old. He had brought his truck to her shop for 11 years, and when she explained what had happened, he told her he would be there in 40 minutes. He arrived in 32. He didn't ask for a price discussion. He walked in, looked at the cut wiring, looked at Silas, looked at the vest on Silas, and then looked back at the wiring and said, "Give me 3 hours." That was the first thing she noticed about what Silas Kane brought with him. Not muscle, not menace, but a kind of gravity that seemed to make other people decide quickly where they stood. Ray Montoya had made his decision in about 4 seconds. He was apparently fine with it. Silas spent the next hour and 40 minutes repairing the hydraulic line in Bay 1. He had tools in his saddlebags that were more organized and better maintained than some professional tool sets Cassidy had seen in 20 years of shops, and he used them with the efficiency of someone who had never had time to be casual about preparation. She worked beside him, not because she needed to supervise. She understood within 10 minutes that he didn't need supervising, but because she could not make herself stop moving. Stopping meant thinking about the 30-day number. Stopping meant hearing the voice from Walter Briggs's doorstep saying your mother would say, "They can have my shop when I'm in the ground." Stopping meant calculating what the insurance adjuster was probably going to tell her tomorrow. And she had been through enough insurance conversations to know that the adjuster's timeline and her survival timeline were not going to align. So she worked, and Silas worked beside her. And somewhere around 9 o'clock, she handed him a wrench before he reached for it, and he glanced at her sideways with a look that was partly surprise and partly something more complicated. "You watch hands," he said. "My mother taught me. She said you can tell everything about a mechanic by watching their hands before they make a move." He was quiet for a moment. "She said that to me once. Almost exactly." Cassidy set down the wrench she'd been holding. "When? 27 years ago. On Route 17, he didn't look up from the fitting he was threading. I was riding with a group, desert run, late October. Bad timing on a cooling system I thought I'd fixed before we left. Bike went down about 14 miles east of town. Group had to keep moving. We had a commitment. People counting on us. They couldn't stay. They left you. That's not an accusation in our world. Sometimes the ride has to go on. I understood it. He tightened the fitting, tested it, tightened it again. I was sitting on the shoulder with a bike I couldn't move and a temperature I didn't know I was running yet. When your mother pulled over in a truck that looked like it was held together by habit and prayer. Cassidy didn't say anything. She didn't ask if I needed help. She could see I needed help. She asked what I was riding, what I'd done to it, and what sound it made before it quit. He paused. I told her. She nodded. She went to the bed of her truck and came back with a tool bag, and she fixed it. Not a temporary fix, a real fix. The right part from what she had with her, properly installed. Took her 90 minutes in the October heat. She always carried parts, Cassidy said quietly. Said you never knew what you'd find on Route 17. By the time she was done, I was running a real fever. She made me get in the truck, drove me back to this shop, called a doctor she knew, made me sleep in the back room for 2 days. He finally looked up. I tried to pay her. I had money on me. She refused. Why did she refuse? He looked at her directly. She said I'd already lost my house and my savings that year. He could see it in the way I was carrying myself. She said people who were down to nothing shouldn't have to pay for basic human decency. He set down the wrench. She was right. I had lost everything. I wasn't going to admit it to a stranger, but she could see it anyway. Cassidy understood, in the specific way you understand something that happened before you were old enough to understand anything, that this was the story her mother had kept behind a workbench for 30 years. Not because it was shameful, because some things were private in the way that real kindness was private, not performed, not displayed, just done and then let go. She never told me, Cassidy said. I know she didn't. She didn't do it to tell anyone. She did it because it was the right thing to do on a hot road with a sick stranger. He stood up from the lift. I left Red Mesa 2 days later and I never came back. Not because I forgot. Because I knew if I came back, I'd feel like I owed her something. And she'd made it very clear she didn't want that. So why now? He looked at what remained of the shop, the boarded windows, the drying stains, the still dark bay too, where Ray Montoya was threading new wire through conduit. Because she's dead, he said plainly, and she can't keep refusing my help anymore. She did not sleep that night either, but for different reasons than the night before. The night before she had been running numbers. Tonight she was running names. Silas Kane. Meridian Compliance Services, the name she had found on an invoice connected to the environmental inspection company that had cited her. Grant Voss. His security director, a man named Paul Drager, whom she had only seen once, standing near the door during Voss's initial visit, never introduced, just present in the specific way that certain kinds of men were present in rooms, making sure everyone in the room knew the weight of the room. She had a notebook on her kitchen table, and she had been filling it since the first delayed shipment. Dates, names, amounts, the exact wording of the anonymous online reviews. She cross-referenced now, and the name Meridian Compliance Services appeared 3 times in 3 different contexts. The environmental inspection, a note on one of the inspection documents about the inspecting company's licensing, and in a conversation she'd had 2 weeks earlier with a woman named Sandra Ossie, who owned a diner 4 blocks away and had told Cassidy that she'd received a letter from a compliance firm about a zoning violation she'd never heard of before. Cassidy wrote Meridian in the center of a clean page and drew lines outward. She fell asleep at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning with her cheek on the notebook. Silas arrived at the shop at 6:30 the next morning with 2 men she had never seen. She was already there. She was always already there, and she came out of Bay 1 when she heard the bikes and watched 3 motorcycles pull into the lot. The 2 men with Silas were both in their 50s, both in plain jackets rather than vests, both carrying tool bags that looked as serious and well-used as Silas's own. This is Hector, Silas said, nodding at the shorter man on the left. He spent 12 years as a diesel mechanic before he retired. This is Frank. He owned an alignment shop in Flagstaff for 20 years. Cassidy looked at them. They looked back at her without performance. I'm not paying biker rates, she said. Hector laughed. It was the genuine kind, the kind that came from actual surprise. Lady, we drove 2 hours before sunrise. We're not here for money. Then what are you here for? Frank looked at Silas, then back at her. Silas told us what happened. He told us whose shop it was. He shrugged. We knew Evelyn, not well, but well enough. He held up his tool bag. Where do you want us? She put Hector on the compressor in Bay 3, which had been developing its squeal for 6 weeks, and which she hadn't had time to address. She put Frank on a preliminary assessment of what it would take to properly rehang the power panel that had been ripped from the wall. She went back to the hydraulic column brace that Silas had started the night before. By 8 o'clock, Bay 1 was functional. She stood there and looked at the working lift and felt something that was not quite relief. Relief was too clean, too uncomplicated for what she felt, but was adjacent to it. Like the moment when you've been pushing against a door that won't open and it finally moves. Just a fraction, just enough to tell you it's not permanently sealed. She opened for business, not fully, not smoothly. Bay 2 was still down. The front windows were boarded plywood and probably would be for weeks. And the shop looked exactly like what? It was a place that had been attacked and was still standing anyway. She called every customer with scheduled work and gave them the choice. She was honest. She told them what had happened. She told them she was operational, but imperfect. She told them she understood if they needed to go somewhere else. 6 out of 8 said they were coming in. The other 2 called back 2 hours later and said they were coming in, too. By noon, Voss's people had found out she was open. She didn't know this immediately. She found out because at 12:47 p.m., her parts supplier called not Carl Denning at the regional warehouse, but the company above him, the distributor, and a woman with a flat administrative voice informed her that effective immediately, her account required prepayment in full for all orders before shipment could be processed. That policy applies to accounts with outstanding balance concerns, the woman said. I don't have an outstanding balance. I've paid every invoice within terms for 6 years. I understand that, Miss Monroe. The prepayment requirement has been applied based on a compliance review. Who initiated the compliance review? A pause. I'm not authorized to provide that information. Then transfer me to someone who is. Another pause. Longer. I'll leave a message with the accounts department. The accounts department did not call back. Cassidy set down the phone and stood very still for a moment. Then she called Detective Ruiz and told her. Timestamp it, Ruiz said immediately. Name of the woman you spoke to, time of the call, exact words she used. In reference to what compliance concern they reviewed, she said she wasn't authorized to tell me. That's useful in itself. Save the call on your phone log. I want a copy. Cassidy texted her a screenshot of the call record within 4 minutes. Her hands moved fast when she was angry. They always had. She told Silas when he came in from the lot. He nodded slowly. The way he nodded at things he had anticipated, but hoped he was wrong about. They know you're still open. So they're moving the next piece. How many pieces do they have? He looked at her steadily. As many as they need, until one of them works. He paused. That means we have to move faster than they do. Move how? Ruiz needs more than your documentation. She needs pattern. Has anyone else on this block had compliance reviews they didn't expect? Supplier problems? Anonymous complaints? She thought of Sandra Osi and the zoning letter. She thought of the notebook and the lines she'd drawn. Maybe, then talk to them. Not me talking to them, you talking to them. You're the one they'll trust. She went to Sandra Osi at 4 o'clock, after the shop had closed. Sandra was 58 years old and had been running the Silver Spoon Diner since she bought it from its previous owner 15 years ago. She made the best biscuits in Red Mesa, which was not a minor distinction in a town that took biscuits seriously. And she operated with the kind of efficient warmth that made her regulars feel like they were eating in someone's home rather than a commercial establishment. She was also, Cassidy now knew, in trouble. They sat in a booth after the dinner rush, And Sandra wrapped her hands around a coffee mug and said, "How bad is it for you right now?" And Cassidy told her, "Exactly," because she had learned from her mother that the fastest way to get someone to be honest with you was to be honest with them first. Sandra listened to all of it. Then she said, "I got a zoning letter in September. Said my grease trap installation violated a code revision from 2019. I had my installer pull all his permits. Everything was compliant. The letter went away after 2 weeks. Who sent it? A company called Meridian Compliance Services." Cassidy's pen stopped moving. "Did you get an offer on the diner before the letter arrived?" she asked carefully. Sandra set down her coffee. Her expression changed the shift of a person rearranging a set of events in their mind and arriving at a new conclusion about what they add up to. 6 weeks before, Voss Development Group. I told them no. I've been here 15 years. I'm not selling. Sandra, I need you to talk to Detective Ruiz. Cassidy, I know. I know it's a police station, and I know it's time, and I know you're worried about what it means for your business. But she's not looking to make noise. She's building a pattern, and yours is one piece of it. Cassidy leaned forward. You're not alone in this. That's what I need you to understand. You're not a single diner with a zoning complaint. You're part of a line that goes back at least a year, and if we don't connect the line, Voss just does it again to the next person. Sandra was quiet for a long time. Her hands moved around the coffee mug. Who else is there? She finally said. I'm finding out. There were 3 others. It took her 4 days to find them all, which meant 4 days of making calls through the network of people who knew people who had sold businesses on the western side of Red Mesa in the past 18 months, not willingly. She suspected, but in the specific way people sold things when they no longer had a realistic choice. The first was a woman named Gloria Chen, who had owned a family tire shop on Route 17 for 22 years with her husband before a sudden credit crisis triggered, they believed, by a series of false reports filed with their commercial lender, forced a sale at a price far below market. She was living in Tucson now and working a job she hated, and when Cassidy called, she was quiet for a very long time before she said anything. I knew it wasn't bad luck, Gloria finally said. I knew it. But my husband, he blamed himself for the loan situation. He thought it was his credit, and I couldn't keep fighting something I couldn't see. She paused. Is someone actually looking at this? A detective. Yes. What do you need from me? Documents. Dates. Any letters you kept. Any names you remember. I kept everything, Gloria said. I kept everything because I knew someday someone would ask. The second was a man named Tony Vasquez, a veteran who had run a welding shop 2 blocks from Commerce Row. His shop burned down. The fire marshal had ruled it an electrical fire. Tony had never believed that, but had no money for a private investigation and no evidence that contradicted the ruling. He had moved to his daughter's house in Phoenix. When Cassidy told him, she thought his fire might have been deliberately set as part of a coordinated campaign. He didn't speak for almost a full minute. Then he said, I lost 17 years of work in that fire. I lost my lease, my equipment, my customer list, everything. I had nothing left. I ended up in my daughter's spare room at 53 years old. His voice was very controlled. The way veterans' voices sometimes were when they were describing something that had broken them. If someone did that on purpose, I need to know. Then talk to Detective Ruiz. I'll make the introduction. The third was not a business owner. She was the widow of one, a woman named Patricia Hollis, whose husband had run a small diner north of town for 19 years. The diner had closed after James Hollis suffered a stroke, which his family privately believed was brought on by the stress of a sustained, coordinated campaign of supplier interference, permit delays, and anonymous harassment. He had survived the stroke, but never recovered enough to work. The diner was sold. He had died 8 months later. Patricia Hollis answered the door in a cardigan and looked at Cassidy with the expression of a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had largely given up expecting anyone to notice. James always said, it didn't make sense, she told Cassidy, in a living room that still had his reading glasses on the end table beside the chair he'd preferred. The way things went wrong all at once after he said no to that developer. He said coincidences don't line up like that. She smoothed her cardigan. He said it felt like someone turning screws. Cassidy drove back to Red Mesa with her notebook full and her jaw set. She called Detective Ruiz in the parking lot of the shop. I have 4 other businesses, she said. 3 owners who will talk to you. And documents going back 18 months. 1 fire that was ruled electrical. 1 death that may be connected to the stress of the campaign. There was a pause on the other end. When Ruiz spoke, her voice was the voice of a detective who has just watched a series of isolated dots become a line. I need to make some calls, Ruiz said. To a state investigator I know. Don't share us with anyone else yet. What about the business owners I found? They're waiting. Tell them to hold their documents and say nothing publicly. I will call each of them personally within 24 hours. Another pause. Cassidy, this is bigger than I thought it was. I know, Cassidy said. She went inside and found Silas at the workbench, doing the kind of fine tolerance work on Walter Briggs's El Camino that would not be visible to anyone who wasn't looking for it but would last for the next 20 years. He did not look up, but he asked, how many? 4 businesses. 1 fire. 1 death. His hands kept moving, but they moved with a different quality for a moment, a barely perceptible change in pressure. The way hands changed when the person attached to them received information that they were absorbing rather than processing. He's been doing this for at least 2 years, Silas said. At least. And he's still going. Which means whatever stopped the others didn't stop him. It just moved him on to the next target. Me. Silas finally looked up. What does Ruiz say? She's calling a state investigator. She said to stay quiet. Good. That's the right call. He set down the tool he was holding. Are you going to be able to stay quiet? She thought about Patricia Hollis's living room. The reading glasses on the end table. James Hollis, who had said it feels like someone turning screws and had been right about all of it and had not lived to see anyone believe him. For now, she said, but not forever. The town council hearing was on a Thursday evening and Cassidy had not intended to go. She had been advised by Ruiz to maintain a low profile. She had work piling up in the shop. She had supplier payments she was having to front in cash because of the prepayment demand, and she had 3 out of documentation to cross-reference before the weekend. She had approximately no time and approximately no energy for a public meeting about the proposed Voss development, which was officially on the agenda as an economic opportunity discussion. She went because at 5:45 in the afternoon, her phone showed her a real-time notification. Someone had posted a new piece on a local news blog. The headline read, "Sources claim controversial auto shop linked to Hells Angels criminal activity." She read it in the parking lot of a hardware store where she'd gone to buy bracing materials. The article was anonymous, attributed only to community sources. It alleged that Monroe Motor Works had been used as a meeting point for motorcycle club members involved in illegal commerce. It named no specifics because it had none. It used the phrase neighbors concerned 3 times. It quoted no actual neighbors. It was carefully written, she noticed, to avoid anything technically actionable while doing maximum damage. She took screenshots. She sent them to Ruiz. Then she drove to the town council meeting. The room was fuller than these meetings usually ran, which told her that Voss's people had done their work. When developers wanted a project approved, they seeded attendance the way farmers seeded fields. She recognized faces she hadn't seen at a council meeting in years. People who had only a tangential connection to the issue, but had been given a reason to show up. Voss was there himself, in the same silver-haired precise presence he'd brought to her office, and he caught her eye when she walked in, and his expression didn't change at all. That was the worst kind of look, not hostile, not surprised. Simply acknowledging, in the way that predators acknowledged movement when they were confident of the outcome. She waited through 40 minutes of procedural discussion before public comment opened. Then she stood up. She had prepared nothing. She had a notebook, and she used it. "My name is Cassidy Monroe," she said. "I own Monroe Motor Works at 412 Commerce Row. I'm the 4th speaker of the evening to mention concerns about this development. I want to address the others. She read from her notebook. Invoice numbers, dates, exact name of the compliance company on the environmental inspection report, the precise correlation between her refusal of Voss's offer and the first delayed shipment, the anonymous reviews, the prepayment demand, the blog post published 3 hours ago. None of those items, individually, proves criminal coordination, she said clearly. But I have documentation of the same pattern, the same sequence, the same companies affecting at least 4 other businesses in this area over the past 2 years. I have business owners prepared to share those documents with investigators. And I am asking this council publicly to require Grant Voss and his representatives to disclose every company and intermediary involved in acquiring the property surrounding my shop. The room was very quiet. I am also asking, she said, that this council recognize that what is being proposed here is not development. It is elimination. The businesses in this community that said no were not purchased. They were pressured, damaged, and eventually forced. And I intend to prove that. She sat down. Voss's attorney immediately requested the floor to characterize her statement as unsubstantiated and potentially defamatory. The council chair allowed a brief response. 2 council members asked follow-up questions. One of them, a woman named Rosaria Fuentes, who had represented the Commerce Road District for 11 years, looked at Cassidy across the room with an expression that was not political, it was personal, the expression of a woman listening to another woman and believing what she heard. She did not win anything that evening. The development was tabled for further review, which was not a victory or a defeat but a pause. What she won was something she couldn't quantify, but could feel she had said it in public, in her own name. And it was now in the minutes of an official meeting, and it could not be unsaid. On her way out, a man touched her arm lightly and said, "Miss Monroe, I'm with the state attorney's office. Detective Ruiz asked me to be here tonight." He handed her a card. That was a very organized statement. "I keep organized records," she said. "I know, Ruiz told me." He glanced across the room toward Voss, who was speaking to his attorney in a low voice. "We'd like to look at them," she told Silas that night, in the shop, while he was helping her install the concealed security cameras that Ruiz had approved, small, legally compliant, positioned to cover the lot and both service bays. "State investigator was at the meeting," she said, handing him a drill bit. "I know. I had someone there too." She stopped. "You had someone at the council meeting?" "An observer, not a participant." He positioned the camera housing against the wall. "I needed to know who else was in the room." She studied him for a moment. "Silas, what exactly are you doing when you're not in this shop?" He held the drill against the housing, making sure I understand the terrain. He looked at her directly. "That's all. Nothing that steps on Ruiz. Nothing that steps on your investigation. I don't fight battles I wasn't invited to fight, but I watch them. And Voss is getting impatient. Impatient people make mistakes." He drilled the housing into place. "Patient people document the mistakes." That was the thing about Silas Kane. Cassidy was beginning to understand. That made him different from what people assumed when they saw the vest and the beard and the scar. He was not a man who solved problems with force. He was a man who had lived long enough to understand that force without strategy was just destruction. And destruction was the least efficient solution to almost every problem he had encountered. She handed him the camera module. "What did you do?" she asked. "Before you were a road captain." "Mechanic," he said, with the absolute simplicity of a man describing the only identity he had ever fully trusted. Always a mechanic. The rest was just things that happened on the way. She thought about her mother, who had said almost exactly the same thing once, in different words. She thought about the photograph behind the workbench. The black and white road, the 2 people on it, who had met at the worst possible moment and had given each other exactly what the moment required. She handed Silas the mounting screws. He installed the last camera at 11:47 p.m., and they tested the feed on her laptop, and the parking lot came up clear and sharp on the screen. And for the first time since 4:47 on a Monday morning, Cassidy Monroe felt something she had almost forgotten the shape of. Not safe. not victorious. Something smaller and more durable than either of those things. She felt ready. The cameras had been running for 11 days when Grant Voss walked back into her shop. He didn't knock. That was the first thing. He pushed the door open, the way people pushed open doors they already considered theirs. And he came through the boarded front with his jacket pressed and his silver hair precise and his hands in his pockets. And he looked at the working lift in Bay 1 and the restored power panel in Bay 2 and the customer's vehicle she had running again. And his expression was the expression of a man recalculating something he had been certain of. Cassidy was under a truck in Bay 1. She heard the door, heard the footsteps, heard the particular silence that followed someone entering a room and deciding not to announce themselves. She rolled out on the creeper, stood up, and wiped her hands on her shop rag, and she looked at him and said nothing because she had learned in the past 2 weeks that silence was a tool, and she was going to start using every tool available to her. Voss looked around the shop for another moment. Then he looked at her. "You're still open." "Every day," she said. "I heard you had some trouble. I had a lot of trouble. I'm still here." He nodded slowly, the nod of a man who was revising his assessment in real time. He walked to the center of the bay and stopped, and he looked at the overhead cameras, the new ones she'd installed, not hidden, not disguised, just mounted, and clearly visible because Ruiz had told her that visible cameras were a deterrent, and she was done being subtle about her intentions. "Those are new," he said. "After someone destroys your security system, you upgrade." Smart. He said it without irony, which was somehow worse. "Cassidy, I came here to have a direct conversation. Business to business. No intermediaries." She set down the shop rag. "Then have it." He looked at her with the full weight of his attention, which was considerable. He was a man who had spent 30 years in rooms where attention was currency, and he knew how to deploy it. "You've been doing some talking around town. To business owners, to the council. To, I understand, someone connected to the state attorney's office." He paused. "I'm not here to threaten you. I want you to know that." "Then what are you here to do?" "Offer you something real." He shifted his weight slightly. "I know what this shop cost you. I know the insurance timeline on your claim. I know what the prepayment demand from your supplier is doing to your cash position." He said it matter-of-factly, the way someone stated facts they'd assembled from research rather than guesswork. "I'm prepared to make all of that go away. Every debt cleared. Your reputation restored publicly. And I will build the Monroe name into the development, a proper tribute to your mother's legacy. A sign, a history display, her photograph. Something that lasts." Cassidy looked at him. She had been waiting for this visit. She had been waiting for it since the cameras went up, since the state investigator's card had gone into her wallet, since Ruiz had called her 2 days ago and said, "We're getting closer, but we still need something direct." She had known, with the same cold certainty that had sat in her passenger seat that first morning, that Voss was the kind of man who made a final offer before he changed tactics. She had prepared for it. What she had not prepared for was how reasonable it would sound. That was the most dangerous thing about men like Voss. They never came at you with anything that was obviously monstrous. They came with things that were almost sensible. Things that sounded like solutions. Things that made you feel, for exactly one terrible second, like maybe the fight was the problem and not the other way around. She breathed through that second. Then it passed. "I want to ask you something," she said, and her voice was entirely even. "And I'd like you to answer it honestly. Go ahead. My supplier prepayment demand. My bank loan review. The anonymous environmental complaint. The online reviews." She watched his face. "Those things all happened after I said no to you. In the same sequence. Affecting the same account relationships. All connected to a company called Meridian Compliance Services." She paused. "Did you arrange that?" He didn't answer immediately. That was its own answer. "I run a development organization," he said carefully. "We use compliance consultants in every market we operate in. That's standard practice. That's not what I asked." He met her eyes. And she saw it, not guilt exactly, not remorse, but the specific look of a man who had made a calculation and was standing behind it. I asked them to help create favorable conditions for the acquisition. Favorable conditions, she repeated. Business is competitive. You destroyed my shop. I don't know anything about that. She held his gaze. You know that my supplier was contacted. You know that my bank was contacted. You know that the online reviews appeared simultaneously from accounts that didn't exist before that week. You know all of that. She took one step toward him. I know you know it because you just told me you know my insurance timeline and my cash position. That is not public information, Mr. Voss. And the only way you have it is if someone has been watching me closely enough to know it. A muscle moved in his jaw. Just one, just slightly. Everyone breaks eventually, he said. His voice was quieter now, not cold, but measured. The voice of a man stating what he understood to be true about the world. I've been doing this for 30 years. I have never met a person who didn't have a limit. Some people find their limit sooner, and some people find it later, but they all find it. The smart ones break before the fire starts. He looked at her steadily. I am giving you the chance to be smart. Cassidy stood very still, and she thought about Tony Vasquez, who had lost 17 years of work in a fire and ended up in his daughter's spare room at 53. She thought about Patricia Hollis's living room and the reading glasses on the end table that no one was ever going to use again. She thought about James Hollis saying, "It feels like someone turning screws," and dying before anyone believed him. She thought about her mother in a black and white photograph on a desert road, refusing money from a man who needed help. I appreciate the offer, she said. I'm going to need some time to think about it. Voss studied her. He was smart enough to hear something in her voice that wasn't capitulation, but he was also confident enough to interpret it as negotiation. Of course, take a few days. He turned toward the door. Cassidy, I want you to understand something. None of this needed to happen this way. I'm not a villain. I build things. I create jobs. I improve towns. But I need the full parcel to do that, and this is the only parcel I don't have. That's all this is. She watched him walk out. She heard his car door. She heard him pull away. Then she went to the small office, closed the door, opened her laptop, and watched the footage playback from the camera above Bay 1. Clear audio, clear image, full conversation. She called Detective Ruiz. He came, she said. A pause. Tell me everything. I can do better than that. She saved the recording file and attached it to the message. I can send it. Ruiz called back 40 minutes later, and her voice had changed. It was focused in the way detective voices got focused when something they had been building toward finally had a visible shape. The recording strengthens things significantly, Ruiz said. He didn't confess to the vandalism directly, but he confirmed knowledge of details about your financial situation that he shouldn't have. He confirmed Meridian's involvement. He used the phrase favorable conditions in response to a direct question about coordinated interference. She paused. His attorney is going to call it general business language. A prosecutor is going to call it consciousness of guilt. Is it enough? Not alone. We need direct evidence connecting him or Dradger to the vandalism and to Vasquez's fire. The pattern is powerful. The recording is powerful. But the destruction itself needs a chain. She was quiet for a moment. The state investigator is ready to move. We're talking about executing warrants on Meridian's offices and on Voss Development Group. But I want to do that after we have a surveillance operation in place. Because Voss is going to try again, Cassidy. He told you himself he's never not gotten the property eventually. He's going to try the fire. Cassidy did not respond for a moment. She looked at her hands on the desk. Her mother's desk, scratched and dented in all the places desks got scratched and dented when they were actually used. When, she said, soon. He's impatient, like Silas said. And after today's conversation didn't go the way he expected, he's going to move faster. A pause. I need you to do something that's going to feel wrong. What? I need you to close the shop. Publicly. Make it look like you're done. The silence on Cassidy's end was absolute. I know, Ruiz said. I know. My customers... My reputation, Cassidy. I know what I'm asking. And I'm asking it because if Voss believes you're broken, he moves. If he moves, we catch him in the act. If we catch him in the act, None of the other victims ever go through this again. She paused. But it has to be your choice. I can't make this call for you. Cassidy stared at her mother's desk for a long time. If I do this, she said finally, and it doesn't work, then we still have the recording, the pattern, the witnesses, and the documents. We don't lose ground if this fails. We just don't gain enough. She closed her eyes. She thought about the photograph behind the workbench. The message on the back. Never forget the man who kept us alive on Route 17. Her mother had trusted someone she didn't know, on a desert road, in the worst moment of his life. She had not asked for a guarantee. She had just looked at what was in front of her and done what needed doing. Okay, Cassidy said, but I want Silas involved in the plan. A brief pause. I was going to suggest that myself. She told Silas that night. He listened to all of it without interrupting, sitting on the workbench in Bay 1, the way he sat on things not casually, not tensely, but with the settled weight of someone who had learned a long time ago that his body needed to be somewhere specific while his mind was doing its real work. When she finished, he was quiet for almost a full minute. He said it himself, Silas said. Everyone breaks eventually. The smart ones break before the fire starts. He looked at her. He's not being poetic. He means an actual fire. I know he did it to Vasquez. He's been building up to it with you for 3 months. The destruction was a warning. The compliance campaign was pressure. The offer today was the last chance he gives people before he stops offering. He paused. If you close publicly, he'll move within a week, probably less. Ruiz thinks 48 to 72 hours. Silas nodded. She's right. He's got people ready. This isn't improvised. He has a crew that does this, which means the crew has done it before and they know how to be fast and clean. He looked at her. You understand that closing publicly means people in this town are going to think you gave up. Some of them won't come back even after you reopen. I know. You're willing to take that? She thought about it honestly. The way she tried to think about everything, honestly, without the comfort of pretending the cost wasn't real. I'm willing to take it if it means Voss doesn't do this to the next person. And the one after that. She met his eyes. Patricia Hollis's husband said no, and he died and nobody believed him. I'm not going to be the next person that happens to. Silas looked at her for a long time. Then he said, I want to bring riders in. For what? As witnesses. Legal witnesses on public ground. No trespassing. No interference with law enforcement. I want them positioned at the end of the highway when Voss's crew arrives, visible and still, so that whoever comes to burn your shop down looks up and sees 50 headlights looking back at them. He held her gaze, not to stop them. Ruiz stops them, but to make sure they know, in that moment, that what they're doing has been seen, and that the people who saw it are not going to forget. Cassidy thought about that, about what it meant, about what the image of it would mean not just to Voss's people, but to every person in Red Mesa who had watched her fight for 3 months and wondered if she was going to make it. How many riders, she said. As many as need to come. I'll make some calls. She was quiet. Silas, this is a police operation. Ruiz has to approve the plan. If your riders interfere, they won't. If they even look like they're going to Cassidy. He said her name with a quiet finality that stopped her. I have spent 30 years convincing men who are angry, men who have very good reasons to be angry, that the most powerful thing they can do is stay exactly where they are told to stay. I have not always been a patient man, but I have always kept my word about this. He paused. Your mother would tell you that, if she were here. She believed him. She wasn't sure when she had started believing him somewhere between the hydraulic lift and the council meeting and the nights they had spent working in the same shop, in the same focused quiet that she had only ever shared with one other person, but she believed him now entirely. I'll talk to Ruiz, she said. She posted the sign on a Tuesday morning. Monroe Motor Works temporarily closed. She made it look real because it had to look real. She called her active customers and told them with genuine regret in her voice. Because the regret was genuine, she hated every word of it. She returned 2 vehicles she had been working on and absorbed the cost of the partial work. She canceled her parts orders. She made herself look, to anyone watching, like a woman who had finally run out of fight. It cost her something she couldn't put a number on. She saw it on people's faces, the careful sympathy of customers who had wanted her to win but had privately expected this, the specific look of a town watching something it valued fail. She saw it on Margaret Okafor's face when Margaret stopped by with a bag of oranges, and Cassidy had to tell her, in carefully chosen words, that the shop was closing for now. She saw Margaret process it and believe it and feel it, and she could not correct the belief, and that was its own particular pain. She saw it on Walter Briggs's face when he stopped by to check on his El Camino. "This isn't right," he said, looking at the sign. "Sometimes things aren't right," she said. "Your mother didn't quit." "I know," she held his gaze. "Trust me, Walter." He looked at her for a long moment with 81 years of watching people and knowing what they meant when they said things. Then he nodded once and went back to his car. And she stood in the empty lot and let out a breath that had been in her chest since morning. Ruiz called that evening. "We've got movement. Drager made 2 calls from a burner phone this afternoon. We can't hear the content, but we have the tower pings. He contacted 2 numbers we've been tracking in connection with the Vasquez fire. How long? Tonight or tomorrow night? Be ready," Cassidy called Silas. "It's happening." "I know," he said. "I'll make the calls." "How many chapters?" A pause. "Enough." She did not stay in the shop. That was the hardest part, not staying. Every instinct in her told her to be there, to be present in the building that was her mother's and hers, on the night when everything was decided. Ruiz had told her clearly that she could not be inside. She would compromise the operation, create a civilian risk factor, and potentially give Voss's attorney grounds to challenge the evidence if it came out that she had been on the premises. So she sat in Ruiz's car, parked 3 blocks away, watching a live feed from the cameras on a tablet screen. The shop sat dark and still on Commerce Row. The parking lot was empty. The sign was up. She had been sitting there for 2 hours and 40 minutes when her phone showed a text from a number she didn't recognize. She opened it. There was a photograph. Her mother's grave, in Red Mesa Municipal Cemetery, plot number 14. The headstone she had picked out and paid for and visited every year on the anniversary. Beneath the photograph were 6 words, in plain text, no punctuation. "Sign tomorrow or lose everything again." Her hands went cold. She showed the screen to Ruiz, who was in the driver's seat. Ruiz looked at it without blinking, took a photograph of the screen with her own phone, and said, "Forward that to me right now. Do not respond. He's watching her grave." Or he took that photograph days ago and held it. Either way, we log it. Ruiz was already typing. "Don't react. Stay focused on the feed." Cassidy looked back at the tablet. The parking lot was still empty. The clock on the screen read 12:08 a.m. At 12:23, a vehicle turned onto Commerce Row without headlights. She saw it on the feed, dark shape, slow moving, stopping at the far end of the lot. Then a second vehicle. Both killed their engines. Both sat without moving for almost 4 minutes, which she understood now was them watching, making sure the building was empty, making sure there was no one who was going to interrupt what came next. She watched them open the doors. She watched 3 figures get out. She could see the fuel containers from the camera angle. She could see the tools. And then she saw something on the feed that made her breath stop. From the far end of Commerce Row, from the direction of Route 17, from the direction of the long straight desert highway that ran through Red Mesa and out into the dark, she saw headlights. Not 1, not 5, dozens. They came in a slow line, without sound on the feed, but she knew the sound they were making because she had heard it her whole life on Route 17. The rolling low thunder of multiple motorcycles moving together, and they came to the end of the block and they stopped. All of them, simultaneously. 53 motorcycles, she would count later in the footage. Riders from 7 Hells Angels chapters across Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, and Colorado. Men and women who had driven through the night because Silas Kane had made some calls, and because Silas Kane's calls meant something in a world that she did not fully understand but was learning to respect. They stopped at the edge of the lot. They did not advance. They did not dismount. They just sat there in the dark with their headlights on, and they watched. The three figures by the shop saw them. She watched it happen on the screen, watched the body language change, watched the specific physical transformation of people who had been confident and purposeful a moment before suddenly becoming people who understood they had miscalculated the size of the room. One of them said something to the others. She couldn't hear it, but she could see the gesture sharp, urgent retreat. They ran for the vehicles. Ruiz was already on the radio. All units, move now. Police intercepted the first vehicle at the north end of Commerce Row. Two men taken into custody within 30 seconds. The second vehicle turned hard onto a side street and made it 4 blocks before it hit a patrol unit blocking the intersection. The driver tried to go around, clipped a curb, and drove through a chain-link fence. Nobody was seriously injured. Nobody from the motorcycle line moved. Not a single one of the 53 riders advanced. They sat exactly where Silas had told them to sit, in the public roadway, on public ground. And they were witnesses to everything that followed the arrests. The processing of evidence, the investigators moving through both vehicles with gloved hands and evidence bags. Cassidy got out of Ruiz's car and stood on the sidewalk 3 blocks away and breathed. Ruiz came to stand beside her. We have them. Her voice was controlled, but Cassidy could hear what was under the control. Both vehicles. We have burner phones, we have the fuel containers, we have what appear to be surveillance photographs of you taken over several weeks, and we have a paper, a list of businesses with your name at the top. And one of the men is already asking to speak to a prosecutor. Cassidy pressed her hand flat against her sternum, the way her mother had pressed her hand when something big happened and she needed to keep herself anchored. Voss, she said, he's watching this happen somewhere. He doesn't know yet what we have. Ruiz looked at her. By morning he will. She drove to the shop alone. Not to go in the building was still a crime scene and would be for hours. She just drove there, parked in the lot, and sat for a moment in the quiet that followed catastrophe when catastrophe has been stopped, just before it completes itself. She heard a motorcycle. 1, not 50. Silas pulled up beside her truck, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the same quiet she was sitting in. Then he got off and leaned against his bike and looked at the building, her mother's building, undamaged whole, standing in the November dark, with the temporary closed sign still visible in the light from the parking lot. They stayed, Cassidy said. I told you they would. 53 riders. She shook her head slightly. You made some calls, you said. Word travels, he said. When it's the right kind. She looked at him. This man who had appeared out of a black and white photograph and a 30-year-old debt that her mother had refused to let him carry. This man who had convinced 53 people to drive through the night and stop at the edge of a lot and hold completely still while a crime was interrupted because he had told them to, and because they trusted him the way people trusted someone who had earned it in a currency that didn't have a name but that everyone recognized. They didn't come because your Silas Kane the road, Captain, she said slowly. Did they? He looked at her sideways. What do you mean? They came because of how you've treated them. Over years. Over decades. She thought about what she'd been slowly understanding since the night he had walked into her destroyed shop. You've spent 30 years convincing angry men to be patient. You said that, and they trust you because you've been right about it. Not because they fear you, because you've been right. He was quiet for a long time. Your mother saw that, he said finally. 27 years ago, on Route 17, she looked at me and she saw something I didn't see yet. He paused. She said, and I've thought about this my whole life since she said, you're going to be all right. Not because nothing bad is going to happen to you, but because you're the kind of man who figures out what to do with it. He was quiet again. I wasn't that man yet when she said it, but I decided to become him because she said it like she was certain. Cassidy looked at her mother's shop. She understood now what Evelyn Monroe had hidden behind the workbench for 30 years. Not a secret, not a shame, a faith. She had kept the photograph because it was evidence not of something that happened, but of something she believed. That the right words, said to the right person, at the right moment, could change what they became. Her mother had kept that faith private and specific, the way she kept everything that really mattered. Cassidy had inherited that too. She looked at Silas, and she said she was right about you. He didn't answer. But something in the set of his shoulders shifted, just slightly, like a man who had been carrying something for 30 years and had just felt, for the first time, the precise weight of it settling. Inside two of the vehicles on Commerce Row, Detective Ruiz and 3 state investigators were cataloging everything that was going to take Grant Voss apart. Burner phones and payment records and surveillance logs and a list of businesses with Cassidy Monroe's name at the top. And outside, in the parking lot of a shop that was still standing, a woman who had learned her mother's faith and a man who had spent 30 years trying to deserve it stood together in the Arizona dark and let the night be quiet around them. The man who decided to talk was named Curtis Webb, and he made his decision at 2:17 in the morning in the back of a patrol car on Commerce Row, while his left wrist was handcuffed to a door handle and his right hand was pressing a folded jacket against a cut on his forehead from fence his driver had taken at 40 miles an hour. He was 34 years old, and he had done 4 jobs for Paul Drager over the past 18 months, and until 11 minutes ago, he had believed that the structure above him was solid enough that no single piece of it could fall on him personally. Then a detective had leaned into the patrol car and said, very quietly, "We have the burner phones. We have the fuel cans. We have photographs of Cassidy Monroe taken over 6 weeks, and we have your passenger already asking for a deal." She had paused. The first person who cooperates fully gets the best outcome. That window closes in about 10 minutes. Curtis Webb had looked at the detective for exactly 9 of those 10 minutes. Then he said, "I want a prosecutor in the room before I say anything." Ruiz had called the state investigator at 2:19. By 3:45 in the morning, Curtis Webb was talking. Cassidy did not learn the details until the following afternoon. When Ruiz came to the shop, she had taken down the temporary closed sign at 7 that morning and opened Bay 1 by 8, because she refused to let the building sit dark for 1 unnecessary hour and sat across from her at her mother's desk with a legal pad and a coffee that had gone cold 40 minutes ago. He identified Drager as the organizer, Ruiz said. He confirmed Drager handled all direct contact with the crews. Voss communicated through 2 intermediaries, never directly. But the payment records on the burner phone go through a shell account that connects to Meridian Compliance Services, which connects to a holding company that Voss controls through a Nevada LLC. She turned a page on the legal pad. He also confirmed Vasquez's fire. The room went very quiet. Cassidy set down the wrench she had been holding. Tony Vasquez's shop. Curtis Webb was not personally present for the fire, but he knew about it. He named the man who set it. That man is currently in Phoenix, and there is a warrant being executed on his residence as of 40 minutes ago. Ruiz looked at her steadily. Tony Vasquez's fire was not an accident. It was deliberate. Curtis Webb's statement confirms what Vasquez always believed. Cassidy thought about Tony Vasquez's voice on the phone. 17 years of work. His daughter's spare room at 53. The controlled way veterans described things that had broken them because they had been trained to deliver hard information without letting the emotion destabilize the delivery, even when the emotion was enormous. "Does Tony know?" she said. "The state investigator is calling him this afternoon." She stood up from the desk. She walked to the window, the new glass, installed 2 weeks ago, still with the faint chemical smell of fresh glazing compound, and she looked out at Commerce Row, at the street that had been her mother's and then hers, and had almost been neither. "What about Voss?" she said. "Search warrants executed this morning on Voss Highway Development Group and on Meridian Compliance Services." Ruiz's voice carried the particular weight of a detective describing something she had worked toward for months and was still processing the reality of. "We have financial records, communication records, contracts between Meridian and shell companies used to fund the crew operations. We have email correspondence between Drager and a Meridian executive that references, and I'm quoting directly, the Commerce Row holdout and accelerated resolution protocols. Accelerated resolution protocols, Cassidy repeated. That's what they called it. She thought of Patricia Hollis's living room. The reading glasses no one was going to use again. James Hollis, who had said it felt like someone turning screws and had been right about all of it. What did they call it with the others? She said. With the diner and the tire shop and Tony Vasquez? Ruiz was quiet for a moment. The same thing. Cassidy pressed her hand flat against the window glass. The way her mother pressed her hand against her sternum when something big moved through her. She understood now where she had learned that gesture. Grant Voss, she said. When? This afternoon. He will be arrested at his office. Ruiz paused, along with Draeger and 4 associates. Cassidy turned from the window. She looked at Naomi Ruiz, this woman who had stopped in a lobby with a coffee and a manila folder 3 months ago and asked 3 questions and started pulling a thread, methodically, patiently, the way good detectives pulled threads, without making noise until the whole thing came loose. You knew it was bigger than vandalism from the beginning, Cassidy said. I suspected. Suspicion isn't evidence, Ruiz almost smiled. Your records were the evidence. Yours and the others. She paused. You built us a map, Cassidy. We followed it. She called Tony Vasquez herself that evening, before the state investigator's call reached him. She didn't plan to. She had told herself that Ruiz and the investigator would handle notifications, that it wasn't her place, that she should stay in her lane and let the process work the way it was supposed to work. She told herself this for about 4 hours. Then she picked up the phone. He answered on the second ring. Tony, she said, it's Cassidy Monroe. I wanted you to hear it from me first, before the official calls come in. She heard him breathe. They got him. They got him. And the fired Tony. The investigator confirmed it. You were right. You were right from the beginning. The silence on the other end was the specific silence of a person who has been right about something terrible for a very long time and has had no one believe them. And now someone does, and the relief and the grief of that come at the exact same moment, and there are no words for that specific combination. My wife used to say I was being paranoid, he said finally. His voice was very quiet. She didn't mean it unkindly. There was no evidence, and I couldn't prove it. And after a while, it starts to feel like maybe you're the one who's wrong, even when everything inside you is saying you're not. You weren't wrong. No. Another pause. No, I wasn't. He cleared his throat. Thank you for calling. I know you didn't have to. I needed to, she said. Because you came to Ruiz when I asked you to, even though it cost you something to do it. And that took courage. The kind that doesn't get recognized. He was quiet for a moment. What happens now? It goes to court. You'll be contacted about your testimony. There's likely a civil settlement as well. The investigator mentioned compensation for affected businesses. She paused. It won't give you 17 years back. No, he said. It won't. A beat. But it means the next person doesn't go through it. That counts for something. That's exactly what it means, she said. After she hung up, she sat at her mother's desk in the quiet shop and felt the strange, complicated weight of a victory that did not feel like she had always imagined victory would feel. She had always assumed that winning would feel clean. It didn't. It felt like the end of something that had cost everyone in it more than it should have been allowed to cost them. And the best thing that could be said about its ending was that it was ending and that the cost would stop accumulating. That was not nothing. She reminded herself of that. That was not nothing at all. Silas came in the next morning and she told him everything. He listened the way he always listened, without interruption, without visible reaction, with the full weight of his attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Draeger arrested this morning. Voss yesterday afternoon. Where? His office. They let the building fill up normally. Waited until business hours, then executed. She almost smiled. Ruiz said he was on a conference call when they walked in. She said he looked at the agents for about 5 seconds before he realized it wasn't a joke. Silas nodded slowly. The crew members? Curtis Webb gets reduced charges for cooperation. The second man from the vehicles is taking the same deal. The driver who went through the fence has a lawyer who's trying to negotiate. She paused. The man from Phoenix, the one who set Tony's fire, was taken into custody last night. And Meridian? Their offices are sealed. The executive who corresponded with Dreger has retained counsel and isn't speaking yet. But the emails speak for themselves. She looked at him. It's enough. Ruiz says it's more than enough. Silas looked at the shop, at the restored lifts, the new windows, the walls that were hers and still standing. He looked at it the way she had learned. He looked at things not just seeing them, but measuring them against something internal, some private standard that had been set a long time ago. Your mother would be furious, he said. She blinked. What? That it had to happen at all. That someone thought they could walk in here and take what she built. He looked back at her. She had a temper. Did you know that? Very controlled, very disciplined. But underneath it, a real temper. When something was wrong, she felt it in her bones, and she did not let it go until it was addressed. Cassidy laughed, actually laughed. The kind that came from genuine surprise, because her mother's temper was something she knew intimately and had never heard anyone else describe. She used to say anger was just love looking for a solution. Silas's expression did something complicated. She said that to me too. On the second day when I was feeling better and trying to refuse her hospitality, and she told me to sit back down. He paused. She was angry that I'd been left on the road. She didn't know me. She didn't know who I was or what I was. But the wrongness of it bothered her. It was in her bones. He met Cassidy's eyes. It's in yours too. She didn't argue with that. There was no point arguing with what was simply true. 3 days after Voss's arrest, his attorney appeared. Not in person. He called the shop number, which surprised her. She had expected any communication to go through Ruiz or the state investigator. She answered because she was elbow deep in a timing chain replacement and didn't look at the number before she picked up. His name was Frederick Marsh, and he had the voice of a man who had spent 40 years charging $400 an hour and had developed the tone to match. He was very polite. He was very smooth. He called her Miss Monroe twice before she had said a single complete sentence. I'm calling on behalf of my client to explore whether there are terms under which Miss Monroe would be open to. No, she said. A pause. I haven't outlined the terms. I don't need you to. The answer is no. My client is prepared to be substantially generous, both in terms of financial resolution for the damages you've sustained and in terms of Marsh. She kept her voice entirely even. Your client had 3 people walk toward my shop with fuel containers at midnight. Before that, he had my suppliers pressured, my bank account reviewed, my reputation attacked through anonymous media, and at least one other business burned to the ground. She paused. He also photographed my mother's grave and sent it to my phone with a threat. I want you to know that I know all of those things, and the state investigator knows all of those things, and there is no dollar amount that constitutes a serious conversation about resolution. A long pause. Miss Monroe, litigation of this complexity can take years. It can be extraordinarily draining, financially and personally, for everyone involved. My client simply wants to tell your client that he should have thought about what he wanted before he decided that my mother's shop was an obstacle. She pulled the phone away from her ear. Don't call this number again. She hung up. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, she was past fear, but from the specific adrenaline of saying exactly the person who needed to hear it without softening a word of it. She went back to the timing chain. She told Ruiz about the call that evening. Ruiz told her she had handled it correctly and would be sending a formal communication to Marsh's office about appropriate channels. Then she said, the civil case is already being structured. Gloria Chen's attorney has filed. Tony Vasquez filed this morning. Sandra Osi is filing by end of week. A pause. Patricia Hollis met with the civil attorney yesterday. There may be a wrongful death component. Cassidy had been afraid of that possibility and hoping for it simultaneously. James Hollis deserved to be named in what happened. Patricia deserved to have someone say, formally and on record, that what they did to her husband was not bad luck and not coincidence and not the natural consequence of running a small business in a competitive market. It was deliberate. It was sustained, and a man was dead. How is Patricia holding up? Cassidy asked. Ruiz paused. She's the kind of woman who holds up. You know the kind. They hold up through everything, and you can see what it costs them, and you cannot make it cost less. But she told the attorney she wants to be there when the verdict comes in. She said James always wanted to be believed. She's going to be there when it happens. Cassidy swallowed. Good, she said. She should be. 2 weeks into the process, her bank loan came off hold. She found out through a letter standard, formal, almost apologetic in its corporate blandness, notifying her that following a review, her account had been returned to good standing, and the previously initiated review process had been closed. No explanation for what had initiated the review. No acknowledgement that the review had been triggered by external pressure rather than legitimate concern. She called the loan officer who had put the hold on her account. He was very careful on the phone. Ms. Monroe, I can confirm that the review has been closed and your account is fully reinstated. I want to know who contacted you in September to initiate the review. A long pause. I know you can't tell me officially. I know you're worried about liability, but a state investigator is going to contact your institution this week as part of a criminal investigation. And whatever you say to me now will look very different from whatever you say to them if those two things don't match. She kept her voice level. So I'm asking you person to person, who contacted you? Another pause. She could hear him deciding. She had learned over the past 3 months what the sound of a person deciding looked like on both sides of a phone conversation. The contact came through a compliance consultant firm, he said finally. They presented documentation alleging financial irregularities in your business accounts. The documentation appeared legitimate at the time. I had no reason to. He stopped. I'm sorry, Miss Monroe. I should have called you directly before initiating a review. Yes, she said. You should have. The firm was called Meridian. I know, she said. Thank you. She hung up and wrote it in her notebook. Another thread that ran back to the same center. Another line on the page that started somewhere and ended at Grant Voss. Her notebook had 73 entries now, from the first delayed shipment through the phone call with the bank officer. 73 documented incidents across 4 months. Every timestamp, every name, every exact word she could remember from every conversation that mattered. She had built it the way her mother had taught her to build a diagnosis methodically, without assuming the conclusion, before the evidence was complete, following each symptom to its source, and then following the source to what was behind it. Ruiz had called it a map. She thought of it differently. She thought of it as a repair log. The record of everything that had been deliberately broken, and the documentation necessary to put it back together. The trial began on a Tuesday in February, and the courthouse in Red Mesa had not seen that many people in its lobby since the last time a case had made regional news, which had been 11 years ago and had involved a water rights dispute that had dragged on for 3 years. This was different. This was faster and denser, and carried a weight that water rights disputes, whatever their economic stakes, did not carry. Because this was about what it cost an ordinary person to say no to an extraordinary amount of money, and whether the law was capable of protecting that right. Cassidy testified on the 4th day. She had been nervous about testimony in the way that honest people were nervous about being put in a formal context and asked to be precise about things they knew to be true, not because she was uncertain about what she knew, but because the formal structure testimony made her feel the full weight of what she was saying in a way that her own notebook did not. These were not notes in a private record. These were sworn words in a courtroom, and they would go somewhere after she said them, and they would matter in ways she could not fully control. Voss's attorney, Frederick Marsh, was exactly what she had expected from the phone call: smooth, patient, methodical, in the way that a surgeon was methodical, looking for the incision point that would open the largest damage with the least visible force. He questioned her for 2 hours and 34 minutes. He established her youth. He established that she had no formal business management training beyond what she had learned from her mother. He established that the Hells Angels, he said the name the way people said the name when they wanted the name itself to do the work, had been present at her shop, had assisted with repairs, had been part of the surveillance operation. So you coordinated with members of a motorcycle club with a documented history of criminal activity, he said. I coordinated with a man who had known my mother for 27 years, she said, and with law enforcement simultaneously. But the motorcycle club's presence was on public ground with the full knowledge and approval of Detective Ruiz and the state investigator. Their presence was documented in the operational plan that was reviewed and authorized before it was executed. She held his gaze. Is there a question? Marsh moved on. He questioned her documentation, the notebook, the timestamps, the photographs she had taken. He suggested that her record-keeping, however thorough, reflected a subjective interpretation of events that could have alternative explanations. She looked at him and said, each item in my documentation is timestamped, corroborated by a second source, and cross-referenced with the financial and communication records seized from Meridian Compliance Services and Voss Development Group. My notebook didn't create the pattern. It recorded what was happening so that I should show it to other people. The pattern was created by your client. There was a moment in the courtroom that she would remember later, a very brief, very specific moment of silence before Marsh moved to his next question. The kind of silence that happens when a room collectively processes something and finds it has nothing immediate to add. She had been her mother's daughter in that moment. She knew it. She did not perform it for the room. She simply was it, and the room felt the difference. Gloria Chen testified on the sixth day. She was 51 years old, and she walked to the witness stand the way she had described, running her tire shop with the specific dignity of someone who had been knocked down very hard and had gotten up and kept going, and who carried the having been knocked down and the getting back up as equal parts of the same identity. She testified for 90 minutes about the false credit reports, the supplier pressure, the phone calls from people who identified themselves as compliance representatives and asked questions about her business practices that had no legitimate regulatory basis. She had saved every letter. She had notes from every call. She had, like Cassidy, built a record of everything that had been done to her, because some part of her had always known that the record was the only weapon she had. Marsh tried to suggest that her business had been struggling before the pressure began. She looked at him with the calm of a woman who had been waiting for exactly that question. We were profitable for 21 of the 22 years we operated, she said. I have tax returns for every one of them. The 1 year we were not profitable was the year the pressure campaign began. I can give you the specific month if you'd like. Tony Vasquez testified on the seventh day. He was 57 years old now, and he walked with the economy of movement of someone who had learned to be careful with his body. And he sat in the witness stand and looked at Grant Voss directly, without anger, not because the anger wasn't there, but because he had decided, Cassidy understood, that looking at Voss with anger was giving Voss something, and Tony Vasquez was done giving Grant Voss anything. He testified about the fire, about arriving that morning to find 17 years of equipment and records and customer relationships gone, about the fire marshal's ruling and his inability to challenge it, about calling his daughter and telling her he needed a place to stay for a while, which had turned into 8 months before her spare room became the thing that was keeping him from nothing. Marsh questioned him carefully because Tony Vasquez on the stand was not a witness, a competent attorney attacked directly. He questioned the circumstantial nature of his belief that the fire was deliberate. He questioned why, if Vasquez had suspected arson, he had not pursued a private investigation. Because private investigations cost money I didn't have, Tony said. Because my shop had just burned down. Because I was sleeping in my daughter's spare room. He paused. Is that a sufficient answer? Or would you like me to explain what it costs a person financially and personally to lose everything they built in a single night? Marsh moved on. Patricia Hollis testified on the 8th day. She wore a dark blue dress, and she brought her husband's reading glasses. She set them on the railing of the witness stand, not in a theatrical way, just practically, the way you set something down when you need your hands free. She testified about the sequence of events that had preceded her husband's stroke, the supplier problems, the permit delays, the stress of a campaign that he had known was deliberate and had been unable to prove. He said to me 3 weeks before the stroke, she told the courtroom, in a voice that did not waver because she had decided it would not waver, that he felt like he was being squeezed out of his own life. He said it like a fact, not like a complaint. James wasn't a man who complained. She paused. He was a man who noticed things accurately and said them plainly. And he was right. He was being squeezed. The difference is that he died, not knowing anyone was going to do anything about it. The courtroom was the specific quiet that rooms got when everyone in them was doing the same thing, at the same time feeling the weight of something true. Even Marsh didn't have a follow-up question. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Cassidy spent those 2 days at the shop, working with a focus that was almost aggressive, not because work was a distraction, but because she had understood something important during the trial. Work was not what she did when she wasn't thinking about something else. Work was what she did when she was thinking about everything at once, because her hands knew what to do, and that knowledge freed the rest of her to process the world. She was under a pickup truck in Bay 2 on the second afternoon when her phone rang. It was Ruiz. She rolled out before the second ring finished. Verdict, she said. Guilty on all state charges. Multiple federal charges are proceeding separately through the federal court. Those will take longer, but the state case is done. Ruiz's voice was the voice of someone who had not allowed herself to exhale until this moment and was now exhaling. Grant Voss is going to prison, Cassidy. She sat on the creeper on the floor of Bay 2 and pressed her hand against her sternum. Drieger, she said, convicted. 4 associates convicted. Meridian Compliance Services has been dissolved, pending asset seizure. A pause. The civil settlement negotiations are already in motion. The attorney representing the affected businesses expects a substantial resolution for all parties within 6 months. She sat there on the creeper for a long moment in the shop that was her mother's and hers and was still standing. Ruiz, she said, what did Patricia Hollis say when she heard? A brief silence. She said, and I want to get this exactly right, because she said it very carefully. She said, James was right. He was right about all of it. I want that to be part of the record somewhere, that he was right. Cassidy closed her eyes. It's in the record, she said. Every word of what she said is in the record. I know, Ruiz said quietly. That was the point. Silas came to the shop that evening without being called. She saw his headlight in the lot, and she walked out, and she looked at him, getting off his bike, and she said, guilty, all counts. He stood by his motorcycle for a moment. He nodded once. The way he nodded at things that were right slowly, with the full weight of a man who did not nod lightly. Your records, he said. Yes, your witnesses. Yes, your mother's shop. She looked at the building. The sign, still slightly imperfect from where it had been repaired. The new glass. The lift visible through the window. The workbench inside that was scratched and stained, and exactly where her mother had left it. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I want to tell you something, he said. And I want you to hear it the way I mean it, not the way it might sound. Go ahead. When I drove into Red Mesa 2 months ago, I was coming because I owed a debt I'd been carrying for 27 years. I told myself I was coming to keep a promise, to honor what your mother did. He paused. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. He looked at the shop. The whole truth is that I had spent 27 years believing that one specific thing Evelyn Monroe did, the way she fixed a bike on a desert road and then refused to be repaid, was the best example I had ever seen of what a person could be. And I needed to know whether what she built still carried that, whether it survived her. Cassidy stood very still. And, she said. He looked at her directly. It didn't just survive her, he said. You made it more than it was. She felt something move through her that had no name she could put to it, something that it was connected to grief and connected to pride and connected to the specific ache of loving someone who was gone and understanding. In a sudden, clear way, that you had been loving them this whole time, through the work you were doing, that the work had been the love all along. She would have argued with you about that, Cassidy said. I know. she would have made a very organized case. Something shifted in his expression, the particular way people's faces changed when they smiled from somewhere much deeper than the face. She was very good at that. I know, Cassidy said. I inherited it. She looked out at the Commerce Row Street, at the other shops along the block, whose owners had gone through their own versions of this fight and had come out the other side of it, scarred and standing. Sandra Osie's diner, 2 blocks down, where the lights were still on after the dinner rush. The empty lot where Gloria Chen's tire shop had been, which was still empty but would not stay that way. Gloria had called her 3 days ago to say she was looking at the lease. I've been thinking about something, Cassidy said, about what happens after. Not just for me. For all of us, Gloria and Tony and Sandra and Patricia and the others. She turned to look at him. We all went through the same thing alone. We all had the same problem, and none of us knew the others had it. Because Voss isolated us. That was the strategy, keep each target separate so no one can compare notes. Yes, Silas said. So I want to build something that makes that harder to do. A network, not just emotional support, though, that too. Practical. Parts exchange, equipment loans, legal contact, emergency labor. If someone comes after one of us, the others know about it immediately. We're not isolated anymore. She paused. I'm calling it the Monroe Roadside Cooperative. He was quiet for a moment. Your mother's name. She built the thing that made it possible. She earns the name. He considered it. You're going to need mechanics in multiple locations to make the parts exchange functional. And relationships with suppliers who'll honor the network's accounts. I know. I know people, he said. In several states. Independent shops, mostly. People who've been doing this work for decades without a lot of noise. People who'd be interested in a network if it was run honestly. She looked at him. Are you offering to help build it? I'm offering to make some calls, he said. Word travels. She almost laughed. You keep saying that. It keeps being true. She looked at the shop once more. Then she said the thing she had been carrying since the verdict. The thing that had taken all afternoon to settle into words. She kept you in a photograph behind a workbench for 30 years, Cassidy said. Not because she was ashamed of you. Not because you didn't matter. Because she kept the things that really mattered private. Specific. She met his eyes. You mattered to her. Silas. You should know that. Not as a debt. As a memory she chose to keep. He did not speak for a long moment. The November wind moved down Commerce Row, the same wind that had come through shattered windows 8 weeks ago, and now moved through a whole and standing place. I know, he said finally. I've known it for 27 years, he paused. But it's different, hearing it from you. She understood that. Some things needed to be said out loud. Some debts were not about money or favors or balance sheets. Some debts were about the specific weight of being truly seen by another person, and the specific relief, decades later, of having that confirmed by someone who loved the same person you did. She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment. Then he shook it firmly, briefly, the handshake of 2 people who had just made a real agreement about something that mattered. I'll be back in the morning, he said. There's a noise in the left fork tube that's been bothering me for 200 miles, and I've been too busy to address it. I'll have the stand ready, she said. He put on his helmet. She walked back into the shop. She sat at her mother's desk and opened her notebook, not the documentation notebook, a different one, blank, purchased 2 days ago. She wrote at the top of the first page, Monroe Roadside Cooperative Founding Principles. Then she sat for a moment, thinking about what those principles were, and then she began to write, and the writing came easily. Because she had been living the principles for 4 months, and she already knew exactly what they were. She wrote until the shop's old wall clock said 11:15. Then she set down the pen and looked at the room. Her mother's workbench, her mother's tools, organized on the pegboard exactly as Evelyn Monroe had organized them, because Cassidy had never rearranged them and never would. The photograph of the 2 of them, Evelyn and Silas, on a desert road lot, young and large in their separate ways, caught in a moment of genuine human goodness, propped against the wall where Cassidy had placed it the morning she brought it in from her truck. She thought about what Silas had said. You made it more than it was. She thought about what her mother had written on the back of that photograph, hidden behind a workbench for 30 years. Never forget the man who kept us alive on Route 17. Her mother had kept Silas in a private photograph. She had kept the story private and specific, but she had kept it, and she had kept it close, in the place where she worked every day, and the keeping of it had meant something even in the silence. Cassidy Monroe had spent 4 months refusing to disappear. She had kept records, trusted the right people, told the truth in rooms that had not always wanted to hear it, and refused, every time she was asked, to put a price on what her mother built. And here, on the other side of all of it, the shop was still standing. She switched off the desk lamp and locked the door and went home. And she did not stare at the ceiling, and she did not run numbers. And she slept for the first time in 4 months without waking in the dark, because the thing that had been unsettled was settled, and the work that was coming was the kind you built with your hands, on solid ground, with people you had chosen and who had chosen you. The civil settlement came through on a Thursday morning in April, and Cassidy found out about it the same way. She found out about most things that mattered not from a phone call she was waiting for, but from one that interrupted something she was already doing. She was in the middle of a valve adjustment on a customer's truck when her attorney called, and she almost let it go to voicemail, because she had learned over the past 5 months that the legal process moved at a pace that had nothing to do with the pace of actual life, and she had stopped organizing her days around it. She answered anyway, because some instinct told her to, and her attorney said, "Cassidy, the settlement has been finalized," and she set down her feeler gauge and sat on the edge of the lift and listened. The numbers were substantial. Not enough to give anyone back what had been taken. She already understood that money and loss were not actually the same currency, that you could not exchange one for the other, at any rate, and come out even but substantial enough to mean something real for each of the affected businesses. Gloria Chen's portion would cover a new lease on a property 2 blocks from her old tire shop. Tony Vasquez's would let him consider reopening his welding operation, or at least let him stop sleeping in his daughter's spare room as a matter of financial necessity rather than choice. Sandra Ose's would cover the legal costs she had absorbed over the past year and leave enough to finally replace the kitchen equipment she'd been nursing along on repairs and hope. Patricia Hollis's portion was the largest, and it had been negotiated with a specificity that the other settlements did not require, because Patricia's loss was not a business and was not a building and was not 17 years of equipment. Patricia's loss was a person, and the civil process had done what it could within its limitations to acknowledge that. Cassidy's own settlement covered her losses and then some. Enough to clear every debt the pressure campaign had created. Enough to restore the insurance shortfall on the damaged vehicles. Enough to fund what she had been planning since February. "Congratulations," her attorney said. "You won." "We won," she said. "There's a difference." Her attorney paused. "Yes, there is." She finished the valve adjustment before she called anyone. She had learned that discipline from her mother, who believed that the work in front of you deserved the full attention you had promised it, regardless of what else was happening. Because the person whose truck it was had trusted you with something they needed, and that trust was worth more than any piece of news, good or bad. When she was done, she called Ruiz. Then she called Tony. Then Gloria. Then Sandra. She called Patricia Hollis last, because that call required the most from her, and she had learned to be honest about what things cost her and to do them anyway, in the right order. Patricia answered on the 3rd ring. "It's finalized," Cassidy said. A long silence. "How much?" she told her. Patricia Hollis breathed in once, audibly. The breath of a person who has been holding something for a very long time and has just felt the first possibility of setting it down. That's more than I expected." "The wrongful death component was taken seriously," Cassidy said. "Your attorney argued it well, and the documentation supported it." She paused. "James's record is in the official case file. His name is in the judgment. That's permanent." Another silence. "He would have been so angry," Patricia said quietly. "Not at you, at all of it. at the fact that it had to get this far before anyone did anything. She paused. He was always angrier on other people's behalf than his own. That was his nature. That's a good nature to have, Cassidy said. It cost him, Patricia said. But yes, it was. She cleared her throat. Cassidy, I want to ask you something, and you don't have to say yes. Ask. The cooperative you're building. The network. Patricia had heard about it through Gloria Chen, who had heard about it at a meeting Cassidy had organized in March. Is there room in it for someone who isn't a mechanic and doesn't own a shop anymore? Someone who just wants to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else? Cassidy looked at her mother's photograph on the wall. The black and white road, the two people on it, who had given each other exactly what the moment required. Patricia, she said, I was hoping you'd ask. She announced the Monroe Roadside Cooperative formally on the 1st of May, which was a Wednesday, and she did it the way her mother would have done it, not with a press release or a public event or a social media campaign, but by opening the shop in the morning and putting a handwritten sign in the window and calling the people who needed to know directly. The sign said, Monroe Roadside Cooperative, Est May 1. Independent garages, shared resources, shared protection. Inquire inside. By noon, she had 4 calls. By end of day, she had 11. By the end of the first week, she had 23 garages across 3 states that wanted to discuss membership, and she had spent more time on the phone than under a vehicle, which bothered her professionally, but which she understood was necessary for approximately this specific period. Silas had made his calls. That was the thing she kept coming back to, the way Silas's network operated. Quietly and specifically, through decades of relationships built on the simple fact of keeping your word with people who were paying attention. He had called shops in Nevada and New Mexico and Colorado that had never heard of Red Mesa but knew the name Silas Kane, and those shops had called other shops, and the word had traveled the way he always said it did. She hired her first 2 apprentices in the same week she launched the cooperative, because she had decided that she was not going to do one without the other. The 2 things were connected, and she was going to treat them as connected. The first was a woman named Deja Washington, 26 years old, who had been a motor pool driver in the Army for 4 and had spent those years watching mechanics work and asking questions and being told to stay in her lane. She had applied to 3 certified automotive programs after her discharge and been waitlisted at all 3 due to cost. She had found out about Monroe Motor Works from a Veterans Resource Center in Phoenix that had gotten a flyer Cassidy had sent out through Tony Vasquez's network. Deja showed up for her interview in clean work clothes with a notebook and a list of questions that told Cassidy immediately everything she needed to know. What do you already know? Cassidy asked. Enough to know what I don't know, Deja said. Is that a problem? That's exactly the right answer, Cassidy said. When can you start? The second apprentice was a woman named Linda Foss, 44 years old, a single mother of 2 who had spent 15 years in hotel management and had been laid off when the property changed ownership, and who had, in the silence of a suddenly unscheduled life, discovered that the thing she had always wanted to do since she was 12 years old, watching her father work on cars, was the thing she had spent 30 years telling herself she couldn't do because it wasn't appropriate or practical or realistic. She came to Cassidy through Sandra O.C., who had heard her say this at the diner counter one morning and had written Cassidy's number on a napkin. I'm 44, Linda told Cassidy, sitting across the desk. I know that's not. My mother started this shop at 38, Cassidy said, after working as a parts counter girl for 10 years, because no one would hire a woman as a mechanic. She built something that lasted 30 years and is still running. She looked at Linda steadily. 44 is not a problem here. Linda Foss blinked. Something crossed her face that was not quite tears and was not quite relief, but lived close to both of them. What do I need to know to start? Nothing, Cassidy said. That's what the apprenticeship is for. Silas came to the shop on a Tuesday in June and pretended he was there for a repair. She heard his bike in the lot at 8:15 in the morning, and she came out wiping her hands, and she looked at him and said, "What's the noise?" "Left fork tube," he said. "Same one from November. It's intermittent." You've been riding on an intermittent fork noise for 7 months? I've been busy. She looked at him with the expression her mother had used for customers who had deferred maintenance until something became a genuine problem. Pull it in. He pulled the bike into Bay 1. Deja was working in Bay 2 and she looked up, made an assessment of Silas that took approximately 4 seconds and concluded with a small nod and went back to what she was doing. Linda was in the training corner of the shop, which Cassidy had set up against the east wall, working through a diagnostic sequence on an old engine block that Cassidy had acquired specifically for apprentice practice. Silas watched them both for a moment. Good hands, he said quietly, meaning Deja. She's exceptional, Cassidy said, keeping her voice low. She's going to be better than me within 3 years, and I'm going to be fine with that. Your mother said the same thing about you once. Cassidy stopped. She looked at him. When? 10 years ago. I used to call her, once a year or so, to check in, not to visit. Just to know she was all right. He said it as though it were a simple thing, though she understood it was not. She told me she had a daughter who could diagnose an engine by sound alone, and that she was better than Evelyn had been at 22, and that this was the most satisfying thing that had ever happened to her professionally. He paused. She said she was worried you were going to take over the shop before she was ready to let it go. Cassidy stood very still. She never told me that. She didn't want you to know she was worried. She thought it would make you hold yourself back. He turned to look at her. She was wrong about that, by the way. You wouldn't have held yourself back. How do you know? He looked at the shop. At Deja in Bay 2, at Linda at the training bench, at the cooperative materials on the desk, the network map on the wall, showing 23-member garages in 4 states, the new security system whose cameras were visible and unhidden because she was done with anything that looked like concealment. Because this is what you did, he said simply. After everything, this is what you built. She went to work on his fork tube. She found the problem, in 20 minutes, a seal that had been slowly degrading for far longer than 7 months. Probably closer to 2 years, the kind of thing you could ride on indefinitely without catastrophe, but which would eventually, at the wrong moment, become a serious problem. This didn't start in November, she said. No, he admitted. Probably not. You've been nursing it. I had other things on my mind. She looked up at him. He was watching her hands with the attention of a mechanic watching another mechanic. The specific quality of professional observation that was its own form of respect. You could have fixed this yourself, she said. Yes, but you didn't. He was quiet for a moment. Some things you let someone else fix, he said. Because the fixing is not really the point. She understood him completely. She had understood him. She realized, since the night in the parking lot when she had looked at him getting off his bike and known that the fork tube was a reason, not the reason. She replaced the seal. She checked the tube, checked the travel, checked the fluid level and the compression. She did it with the same thorough attention she gave every piece of work that came through her shop, because the work was the standard, and the standard did not change based on who the work was for. When she was done, she told him what she had found and what she had done and what he should watch for. He listened the way good clients listen seriously, and without pretending he already knew. What do I owe you? He said. Nothing, she said. Cassidy, you drove 2 hours before sunrise in November to help a woman you didn't know repair a hydraulic lift. You spent 2 months calling everyone you knew on my behalf. You organized 53 riders to be witnesses without being asked twice. She looked at him steadily. A fork seal doesn't come close. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, the way he nodded at things that were right. Thank you, he said. Welcome. He drank the coffee she poured him and watched Deja work and asked Linda 3 questions about the diagnostic sequence she was running that were calibrated precisely to where she was in her learning, not too advanced to discourage her, not too simple to be condescending. Linda answered all 3 and got 2 right and asked a follow-up question about the 3rd that told Cassidy she was already thinking past the level she was currently at. When Silas left, Linda looked up from the engine block and said, "Who is that?" "An old friend of my mother's," Cassie said. "He knows engines," He knows everything, Cassidy said. He just makes you think you figured it out yourself. Linda looked at the door through which Silas had just exited, then back at Cassidy. That's a good skill. The best kind, Cassidy said. The anniversary was in November. 1 year from the morning, she had driven down Commerce Row and seen the glass. She had not planned an event. She had thought about it and decided that formal commemorations were for other people, for the kind of person who needed the marker, the ceremony, the ritual acknowledgement that something had been survived. She was not that kind of person. She was the kind of person who marked things by working through them. But Silas had made some calls. She found out at 7 in the morning when the first bike arrived. A single rider, a woman she didn't know, who pulled into the lot, looked at the sign and said, "Monroe Motorworks?" "Yes," Cassidy said. "Safety inspection day?" She looked at the woman for a moment. Then she looked at the lot, where 3 more bikes had turned in while they were talking. Then she looked down Commerce Row and saw at the far end the leading edge of a line of motorcycles that went back far enough to disappear around the Route 17 curve. She called Silas. "You made some calls," she said. "I mentioned it," he said. She could hear the engine of his own bike in the background. He was already on the road. Evelyn used to do safety inspections for riders every year on Route 17. "I thought it would be a good way to remember her." "You thought, Silas. There are 30 bikes in my lot already and more coming." "I know. I told them to bring their own coffee. You don't have to provide anything." "That's not the point. I know what the point is," he said. "The point is that your mother spent 30 years helping riders on Route 17, and almost nobody knew her name outside Red Mesa. I want people to know her name." A brief pause. "Is that all right?" She stood in the lot of her mother's shop on a November morning with 30 motorcycles already parked and more coming. And she thought about Evelyn Monroe standing on a desert road in a black and white photograph, refusing money from a man who needed help. And she thought of 30 years of free safety inspection and discounted oil changes for elderly drivers and a daughter left with a shop and a standard to meet. "It's all right," she said. "Get here fast. I need help managing the intake." He arrived 20 minutes later. By then, there were 61 motorcycles in the lot and spilling onto Commerce Row, and the street had taken on the organized chaos of an event that no one had officially organized, which was the only kind of event her mother would have approved of anyway. Gloria Chen was there, with tools, because Cassidy had called her 2 days ago about a completely unrelated parts exchange question, and somehow the conversation had ended with Gloria saying she would come up for the week. Tony Vasquez had driven from Phoenix the night before and was sleeping on her couch and had shown up at 6:30 with a box of pastries and the air of a man who had decided he was going to be useful today, and there was no discussing it. Sandrosi had closed the diner for the morning and brought enough food for everyone, arranged on folding tables in the parking lot with the efficiency of a woman who had been feeding large groups of people for 15 years. Patricia Hollis stood near the door of the shop and directed intake. She had a clipboard and a pen and a system that she had organized herself because Patricia was the kind of woman who, given a role, executed it with full commitment and no fuss. She greeted every rider, logged their information, told them approximate wait times, and did all of this with the brisk warmth of someone who had found, after a very hard year, that being useful was its own form of healing. Deja ran Bay 1. Cassidy had suggested working together, and Deja had said, with the directness that was her particular quality, "I've been trained for 6 months, and I know what a safety inspection is. Put me in Bay 1, and you take Bay 2, and we'll get through twice as many." She had paused. "Unless you don't trust me yet." "I trust you," Cassidy said. "Then Bay 1, Deja said. And that was the end of that. Linda worked as runner and assistant, moving between bays with parts and tools and questions. And the questions she asked were better every week, sharper, more specific, aimed at understanding, rather than just executing. She had told Cassidy 2 weeks ago that she had started dreaming about diagnostic sequences, which Cassidy had taken as one of the better signs she had encountered in an apprentice. Silas did not take a bay. He moved through the lot talking to riders, answering questions about the cooperative. taking down contact information for garages in 6 states that wanted to join, and doing it all with the unhurried attention of a man who had all the time in the world, which she knew he did not, but which was the particular gift he gave to every conversation he entered. By noon, she had completed 32 inspections. By 3 o'clock, the number was 67, and the riders coming in included not just Hells Angels members, but independent riders and small club members and a family on a touring trip who had seen the activity from Route 17 and pulled off to ask what was happening and stayed for 2 hours after Cassidy explained. At 4 o'clock, a police car pulled into the lot. She saw it and felt the old reflex, the alertness, the quick calculation before she recognized the driver. It was Naomi Ruiz, out of a suit for the first time Cassidy could remember, in jeans and a jacket, carrying 2 coffees, and looking at the crowded lot with an expression that took a moment to read, and then was very simply happiness. Cassidy met her in the lot. "You're not on duty," Cassidy said. "Day off." Ruiz handed her a coffee. "I heard there was something happening on Commerce Row." "Word travels," Cassidy said. Ruiz looked around the lot, the bikes, the people, the food tables, the 2 bays running, with Deja visible in Bay 1 doing a brake inspection, with the focused competence of someone who had been doing it for years. The cooperative sign in the window, the riders talking to Silas about something that made 2 of them pull out their phones and exchange numbers. "Your mother would have loved this," Ruiz said. "She would have complained about the crowd and the noise, and then stayed until everyone was gone," Cassidy said. "And then she would have gotten up the next morning and done it again." Ruiz smiled. "Sounds familiar." Cassidy drank her coffee and looked at the shop. At the sign, repaired but deliberately imperfect, exactly as she had left it, the slight unevenness that was not a flaw but a record, the mark of something that had been damaged and put back together by hands, that understood that restoration was a kind of lie, and that the honest version was the one that showed what the thing had been through and kept going. "How is Voss doing?" she asked. "Federal sentencing is in March," Ruiz said. "The state sentence is already running. His attorneys are appealing, but the case is there's nowhere for the appeal to go. The documentation was too complete." She paused. "Your documentation, our documentation," Cassidy said. "Gloria and Tony and Sandra and Patricia. Everyone who kept every letter and every invoice because they knew someday it would matter." "Yes," Ruiz said. "All of you." They stood in a parking lot full of motorcycles and people and the specific noise of a community that had assembled itself around something worth assembling around, and it was loud and imperfect and not what anyone had planned, and it was exactly right. The moment that Cassidy would carry longest did not happen in the lot. It happened at 5:30 in the afternoon, when the crowd had thinned to the last dozen riders and Sandra's food tables were mostly bare, and Deja was doing the final cleanup in Bay 1 with the systematic thoroughness that was her signature. She found it while she was straightening the wall near the entrance where she had hung her mother's photograph 6 months ago. It had shifted slightly, the way wall hangings shifted in old buildings with uneven settling, and she straightened it and then stood looking at it for a moment the way she had stood looking at it 100 times before. Evelyn Monroe and Silas Kane on a desert road, black and white, young in their different ways. And she noticed, for the first time, something she had not noticed before, or had noticed and not processed. The way you could look at something every day and only truly see it when you were finally ready to. Her mother was laughing, not smiling. Laughing, head slightly tilted, something caught in mid-expression, the specific candid quality of a photograph taken at the exact moment when someone forgot they were being photographed. Cassidy had looked at this photograph dozens of times and had seen the dignity of it, the significance of it, the history. She had not seen the laughter. Evelyn Monroe, on the worst stretch of road on a bad October day, fixing a stranger's motorcycle in the desert heat, had been laughing. Cassidy stood at the wall and felt something open in her chest. Not grief this time. Something wider than grief. Something that had grief in it, but also had joy, and also had the specific gratitude of a person who suddenly understands something about someone they loved, not a secret, not a revelation, just a true thing they had been standing next to without seeing. Her mother had not helped Silas Kane because she was noble. She had not done it because she was performing virtue or building reputation or working towards some future reward. She had done it because helping someone who needed help in the specific way they needed it was something that made her laugh. It was something she found genuinely, deeply, constitutionally satisfying. It was who she was, and being fully who you were was something that sometimes, in the right moments, made you laugh. "You're standing very still," Silas said, from behind her. She had not heard him come in. She did not turn around. "She's laughing," Cassidy said. A pause. Then he came to stand beside her. He looked at the photograph. She watched his face in her peripheral vision, watched the years of it, the weight and the patience and the specific look of a man encountering a memory that has not lost its force. "She laughed a lot," he said quietly. "Not at things, not at people, just at the shape of things, the way things happened." He paused. "She fixed my bike, and she was talking to me about something I don't remember what. I was feverish and only half following, and she laughed at something she said herself. I remember thinking, this woman is completely at home out here on this terrible road in this impossible situation. This is just her world, and she's at home in it." Cassidy finally turned to look at him. "That's what I want," she said. He looked at her. Not the shop surviving, not the trial, not even the cooperative. She looked around the room, the workbench, the pegboard, the two apprentices she could hear talking in the training corner, the photograph on the wall, the imperfect sign, all of it. "I want this to be my world, and I want to be at home in it, the way she was." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "You already are," he said. "You've been at home in it since the morning after the attack when you put on your coveralls and started cleaning up. You just didn't recognize it because you were too busy surviving." She thought about that, about the distinction between surviving and inhabiting, about the difference between enduring something and being at home in it. She looked at the photograph once more. "I'm going to hang one more thing next to it," she said. "Something I've been thinking about." She went to the desk and found the notebook, the blank one she'd opened in February and filled with the founding principles of the cooperative, and she tore out a page. She found a pen. She wrote 7 words in her own handwriting, which was nothing like her mother's careful slanted script and was entirely its own thing, which was exactly as it should be. She pinned it to the wall beside the photograph. It said, "Repair what is broken. Protect what is honest. Never mistake kindness for weakness." She stepped back. Silas read it. He was quiet for a long time. "She would have argued about the wording," he finally said. "I know. She would have said it was too direct. And you would have told her directness was a virtue. And she would have said that all virtues became vices when taken too far." Cassidy paused. "And then she would have left it on the wall anyway, because she agreed with the substance." "Yes," Silas said. "She would have." He looked at the wall, the photograph, and the 7 words and the 30 years of Evelyn Monroe that lived in both of them, and he put his hands in his jacket pockets, and he stood the way he stood when he was fully present in a moment, not moving through it, but living it, which was a quality she had come to understand, was one of the rarest things a person could offer. She walked to the switch by the door and turned on the shop's weathered exterior sign. The light came on slightly uneven, slightly imperfect, exactly as it had always been since the night 2 months ago when she had rehung it and deliberately left it slightly imperfect, because this was what the shop was and she was done pretending otherwise. Through the window, she could see the last riders in the lot starting their bikes. The sound rose and then, one by one, subsided as they pulled onto Commerce Row and turned toward Route 17. She watched their taillights move away into the Arizona dusk, some heading west, some east, some north toward Nevada and Colorado and all the long roads that connected everything eventually, if you were willing to follow them far enough. Deja came to stand beside her, drying her hands on a shop rag. She looked at the departing riders. "Same time next year," she said. "Same time next year," Cassidy said. "I'll take Bay 1 again." "You always take Bay 1. "Because you let me," Deja said, with the directness that was her particular quality. "Which means you think I'm ready, which means I need to be ready. So I am." Cassidy looked at her, this young woman who had driven a motor pool truck for 4 years and watched mechanics work and asked questions and been told to stay in her lane, and who had walked into this shop 6 months ago with a notebook and the right answer to the right question. And she felt the particular satisfaction her mother had described. The satisfaction of watching someone become something that was entirely theirs. "You're more than ready," Cassidy said. Linda came out of the training corner with a question about a diagnostic she had been working through a real question, a good one, the kind that came from genuinely not knowing something rather than from wanting to demonstrate that you were trying. Cassidy answered it fully, then asked Linda a follow-up that reframed the problem, and watched Linda's face as the reframe landed and opened a new angle she hadn't considered. "Oh," Linda said. "Yes," Cassidy said. "So the whole time I was looking at the symptom, you were looking at the right thing. You just needed to look one level deeper." Linda nodded slowly, writing it in her notebook. "I'll do the sequence again with that in mind." "Good. That's exactly right." Linda went back to the training corner. Deja went back to her cleanup, and Cassidy stood by the door of her mother's shop and looked out at the Commerce Row Street that was quiet now. The last bike's gone, the November dusk settling over Red Mesa with the particular quality of desert evenings, clear and wide, and carrying a cold that reminded you that the day had genuinely ended and tomorrow was a separate thing. Silas came to stand beside her one last time. She had known he would. She had not hurried the moment, not prepared for it. She had let it come the way her mother had let things come on their own time, at their own pace, without forcing the shape of it. "Are you heading back tonight?" she asked. "In a while," he said. "I want to take Route 17 at dusk. Your mother always said the light was best out there between 5 and 6. She was right." He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that was not empty but full of everything that had been said, and everything that didn't need saying, which was its own kind of completeness. "Cassidy," he said. "Yeah. Do you ever regret it?" Saying no to Voss, she had known he would ask this eventually. He was the kind of person who asked the direct question when everyone else danced around it, because he had learned a long time ago that directness was a kindness and indirectness was usually fear wearing better clothes. She looked at the shop. She looked at Deja's shadow moving in Bay 1, meticulous even in cleanup. She looked at Linda's light still on in the training corner, still working, still asking the next question. She looked at the cooperative map. On the wall, 23 garages, 4 states, a network that didn't exist a year ago and now caught people before they fell. She looked at Patricia Hollis's number in her phone, saved under P, and she thought about the clipboard in the parking lot today and the brisk, efficient warmth of a woman finding her way back to usefulness after loss. She looked at her mother's photograph and the 7 words on the wall beside it. She looked at the imperfect sign she had turned on 10 minutes ago and left the way it was, because this was what the shop was, and what the shop was enough. He wanted the land, she said. He never understood what was standing on it. Silas was quiet for a moment. "Then no," he said. He never did. She switched off the interior lights, one bay at a time, the way her mother had switched them off at the end of every day methodically. In order, the way you ended things that you were going to begin again tomorrow. She left the sign on. The exterior sign of Monroe Motor Works stayed lit because the shop did not disappear after hours. It was there. It had always been there. It was going to be there tomorrow and the day after that. Silas put on his helmet. He walked to his bike with the unhurried ease of a man who had somewhere to be and was entirely confident he would get there. He started the engine, and it caught clean and steady, the fork tubes silent and smooth and properly sealed, the way things were when they had been correctly attended to by someone who knew what they were doing. He looked at her one last time through the open visor. She raised her hand. He nodded. He pulled out of the lot and turned onto Commerce Row, and she watched his taillight move away toward Route 17, toward the long, straight desert highway where her mother had once fixed a stranger's motorcycle and laughed on a terrible road and given someone something they carried for 27 years. Cassidy Monroe stood in the lot of her mother's shop as the last light went out of the Arizona sky. She breathed the cold, clean air. She thought about tomorrow, the 6 appointments on the schedule, The cooperative call at noon, the diagnostic sequence she needed to walk Linda through, the parts order she had been meaning to place, the simple accumulated weight of a life's work resuming its rhythm after a long interruption. She was 29 years old. She had been tested by a man who believed that everything had a price and everyone had a breaking point, and she had proven him wrong on both counts. Not through fearlessness, she had been afraid, many times, in many ways, but through something more durable than fearlessness, something her mother had built into the bones of this place long before she inherited it. She had preserved what was honest. She had trusted what was true. She had refused to let the shop become a number on someone's balance sheet because it was not a number. It was 30 years of a woman's best work. It was the hydraulic lift Silas Kane repaired in a single night. It was Tony Vasquez driving from Phoenix with pastries at 6:30 in the morning because he had been believed and he wanted to be useful. It was Patricia Hollis on a metal folding chair with a clipboard, doing the work because the work was how you came back. It was Deja Washington in Bay 1 ready. It was Linda Foss in the training corner asking the next question. Monroe Motor Works had survived, not because Cassidy was fearless, and not because a legend had ridden in to rescue her, and not because the law had moved with unusual speed or the good people had outnumbered the bad ones on any given day. It had survived because one woman had kept her records straight and her voice clear and her hands moving, and had trusted, really trusted, the way her mother had trusted a stranger on a desert road, that doing the right thing precisely and completely was the most powerful thing available to her. And she had been right. The sign burned steady over Commerce Row. The shop was whole. The work would continue in the morning. Cassidy Monroe turned up the collar of her jacket against the November cold and walked back inside to finish what she had started, because there was always more to do, and she had always been the kind of person who did it.